All right, welcome everyone. Exciting topic tonight. A little bit of back and forth, a little bit of fighting, probably a little bit of spicy conversation going to happen tonight. I have with me my good friend Stephen Boyce. He is below me. And on the other side, I have Eric Bess and Ricky, Captain Dadpool, who is a TikTok celebrity for sure. How you guys doing tonight?
Pretty good, man.
Hanging in there.
Why, Ricky, how come you haven't posted videos lately? I like your videos, despite disagreeing with almost everything you say.
I appreciate that. I recently got it, or fairly recently got a job that I really enjoy, but it's got me working really crazy hours.
Yeah, that's stupid.
Beyond that, I've just
getting a job.
Struggle finding the motivation to make content or even be on social media in general. I haven't even been on like Facebook or Twitter or anything much lately. I'm hoping the bug will bite me again at one point, but
totally understand where you're coming from. I see that happen for a lot of people.
It is a struggle. People don't realize.
Sure. So Eric messaged me a while ago. We've had conversations on Facebook about, and he was talking about possibly doing a reply to this series that Stephen and I put together, arguing for gospel reliability. And Eric's incredibly intelligent. Every time I talk to him, I'm blown away. And I was like, why not, instead of like having a video back and forth where you said this, now we say this, and it's like gasoline constantly be throwing on a fire. Why don't we just have a conversation? And then I was like, Stephen did help with the series a lot that we put out. So I figured like, let's have him on. But then Eric can't be 2-on-1. So he recommended Captain Dadpool to come on. And I just figured we'll just have a conversation, like kind of style, like on the show Unbelievable, where there's not like opening statements or anything. We're just going to chat about what we think about this topic. And yeah, that sounds good for everyone. We can dive right in.
Yeah. The first thing I want to say, if I can go ahead and say something, is I appreciate you for bringing me on, Michael. I think this is a great topic. I think your video series is well put together. Lots of content there. But I want to make it clear that I'm not here to, fight or argue or try to convert or deconvert any of your followers or anything like that. I just want to have a good conversation.
Yeah.
And I think Michael's a good guy. Like I said, like he said, he's had a couple of conversations with me, and I really enjoyed them. So we had a little heart to heart, and he's helped me out.
Thank you.
With a thing. I won't talk about it, but I really appreciate that, Michael. So
yeah. You let me know if you need any more help in that area. I'll see what I can do. Yeah. I got Stephen with me. Anything you want to say, Stephen? You've been certainly quiet down there in your 90s. Stephen's coming to us from the year 1996. He's projecting to the future with that background. Reminds me of like an R&B set for some reason from the 90s.
I grew up in the 90s, and I'm so bitter that we're not in it. So I'm just trying to relive it in my own world. So if I can just have this minute, you stop taking it from me. And you also insulted me. You said I'm beneath you. So I mean, what does that mean? Like, you see, I'm beneath you. I'm less than you. I mean, what are you saying here?
Yeah, for sure. So just to dive right in, I think Stephen and I technically do have the positive here. And so just to sort of like put out a couple like real quick like arguments as to why we think the Gospels are reliable. There's, of course, many reasons, which we cover in the series. I would say the two strongest, when I was sort of thinking of this over, as to why we think the Gospels are reliable, and this can be a good starting point for us. And Steve and I were talking about this. We would say the two arguments that we think are the most convincing would be, in the early church, we have unanimous attestation that the gospel authors are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now the early church fathers disagree on so many things. They disagree on where the gospels were written, who was present when they were written, the order they were written in, the time they were written in. So we have conflicting accounts depending on who you go to, but they do tend to agree for the most part that it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We don't have any other titles attributed within the first few centuries. And then the other argument we would have is the recent paper that was put out by Luke Vandewey and Jason Wilson on onomastic congruence in the Gospels. So they ran a mathematical model, and they said that, and they compared the Gospels in Acts to Josephus, a control group, Apocrypha Gospels, and then modern novels. The modern novels, the Apocrypha Gospels, and the control group were a 0%. Josephus got a 6% accuracy in terms of their naming pattern. And what they basically found was that if you were to go through Jerusalem and ask 100 people their names, you have a 6% chance you get the naming pattern you find in Josephus. Whereas The Gospels got an 86% chance. So very strong evidence that the naming pattern aligns with the names we see in the first century. So those would be the two basic arguments we could always start out with. It seems as though the unanimous attestation from the church is that it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And to support that, they have the Gospels to have strong onomastic congruence. So either Eric or Ricky, you guys can start, just throw what you want. If you want to take it somewhere else, that's fine too.
Can you link the or post the link to those studies in the private chat or something so I can read them later?
Yeah, I'll get you.
I'm curious. If you can, it's okay. If you don't have them pulled up, it's fine.
I can get it pulled up pretty quickly here. Yeah, I can get you that. Sure, no worries.
Yeah, I haven't had the opportunity to read Van der Way, and who else is it? Who else wrote the
Jason Wilson. Jason Wilson's a statistician. Yeah. So what they took is, like Richard Bauckham's old argument, and Jesus in the. So like we know that Blaze and Camille, they replied. Well, Luke Van der Way and Jason Wilson replied to their paper and showed some issues with their methodology, and they offered this other methodology, and this was their results they came up. But let me find that for you, Ricky, and I will get you that right away.
I'm not going to read it right now. We don't have that kind of time, but
no, we'll wait.
For my own benefit later on.
Yeah. Yeah, I got it right here. Yeah, that's they've made it public domain, so I'll get that for you in the chat here, the private chat.
So and of course, in a nutshell, what is this study saying? Like, it uses the same names more frequently and more consistently than the Gospels, or less than? I mean,
so I also dropped this in the private chat. This is a short video I did on their study that they helped me write. So cool. We wrote a script about it, and it's like 11 minutes long if you want to watch it. So basically, what it was like this. It's like this. Here, I give an analogy when I'm explaining. If you were asked to write a novel about people living in Georgia in the 1960s, like, it'd be very hard to get the right distribution of names. Like, there's going to be a name that's going to be the most popular. There's going to be names that are like middle tier, and there's going to be names that are not going to be popular, like Jebediah, for example. Probably wouldn't be a pretty popular name, but there might be someone who has that. Likewise with the first century, like this is the same argument Bauckham was building up. Like the most popular names are going to be Simon and Joseph. Then you're going to have middle tier names. Like, I think Matthew's kind of closer to the bottom, but it's kind of in the middle. But then names like Zacchaeus are going to be exceptionally rare. So we should expect when we look at the Gospels, there are going to be more Simons and Josephs. There's going to be less Zacchaeuses. And so that kind of like naming distribution, the more popular names should show up more frequently in the Gospels. The middle tier names should show up about a little bit less, and then the low percentage of names should do. So what Wilson and Luke Van der Way showed is that the naming pattern in the Gospels aligns very well with the naming patterns in Taolan's database of names from the first century. And they also showed in the study it doesn't align at all with names in the diaspora, so Jews living outside of first century Judea. And so what the basic argument is that Luke Van der Way makes is that if these are eyewitness accounts, we would expect that type of naming pattern, because when we look at the Apocrypha Gospels, they got 0%. Their names just are completely not aligned. Their naming distribution does not at all align with what we see in the Gospels. Also with things like the novel Ben-Hur, they use that in the study. This is someone who studied ancient works, and he trying to make it as most accurate as he could to the first century. His naming distribution did not at all fit, even though he had access to libraries. So even when modern researchers were trying to make novels and trying to make it work, they couldn't get the right naming pattern, but the Gospels and Acts were able to.
So I believe that Camille and Brian are working on a response to that. I'm not a statistician, so I really can't speak on like the mathematical side of it, I suppose. But my question would be to you or Stephen Boyce, like, what does that really imply? Okay, so for example, if you have like the apocryphal Gospels, and let's say they get it wrong, how consequential is that? Because in my thinking, I mean, at most, that would prove that the authors of the Gospels were at least native to the region, or at least familiar with the region. Like, if they were diaspora Jews, we know diaspora Jews, frequently visited the motherland, in Israel. So
feast days.
And if they were educated, which they obviously were, like, I don't know, is it really that implausible that they could I don't know, like even if they knew people with the names that we find in the Gospels. I mean, because like when you look at like ancient novels or let's just take ancient novels for example, Cariton's Daphne or Callirrhoe or Longus is Daphnis and Chloe. I mean, there are some important and notable like aspects of verisimilitude in those works. The Alexander romance. One of the points I had recently read from classicist Matthew Ferguson, I think, was in the Alexander romance. There are a couple of made up characters who are allegorical characters. We know from the historical evidence that the author had replaced these actual historical characters with these allegorical characters, but yet the allegorical characters fit the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, like in terms of like the names that were used at that time. So how much do you think that increases the probability that the Gospels are reliable historical texts, in the sense that we can really say, like, we can trust them when we can't verify, their stories?
Well, I would say
you
that.
know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I would say it's not a singular argument, but it is an important one, because if we're trying to figure out date, location, provenance, and things like that, there has to be some sort of consistency with the timeline, the people, the witnesses, and those who are involved. Because if they're based on eyewitnesses who were with Jesus from this location, and within the narratives, you have these multiple cities and towns, and you have these individuals who are part of this kind of group or that part of group, because you have the Sanhedrin, you have different groups breaking off into that. You have the Pharisees, the Sadducees. You should find consistency. I mean, I live in the Southeast United States, and my family, before they moved down here, were all from up north. It's interesting to talk to family from up north, their perception of us in the South. They have a perception of us that is semi-correct, but unless you live in the South and you actually eat the types of food that we eat and use lingo and language that we do here, you really don't understand Southern culture until you're actually integrated in it. So what we would say is that when you're looking at the apocryphal gospels or these pseudo gospels, they attempt to understand the Palestinian part of the world that involves these names, these places, and so forth. And they're actually getting it wrong consistently, which shows that they weren't integrated in the culture, the people, and the region, which makes sense because we have cause to believe that many of the pseudo gospels particularly were more so in Egyptian, Alexandrian descent. But when you're looking at these gospels, it seems like whoever was behind them, even if it wasn't Matthew, Mark, and Luke and John, even if it wasn't them, whoever was giving the material, the witness testimony of the things, had very close understanding of the proximity, the places, and the people, enough to be coincidentally correct 85% or close to 85% of the time, as opposed to some of these other writings were around 5% and 6% and 0. And so it shows a pattern of consistency. It shows a pattern of weight, and it shows an integration into the culture and the people that were around within the narratives. So if you're trying to paint that you're a part of the narrative, like that's what the Gnostic Gospels are doing, right? That these individuals were with Jesus. They were a part of this story. They were a part of this instruction, but yet they get so much of it wrong, and they can't even get the people and the naming of it correct. It raises major flags as to the accuracy and validity of the text, as opposed to the one that's getting it right the majority of the time. It doesn't prove the finality. It's like, well, that's it. Let's just pack it up and go home. I mean, they're all reliable, but it points us to a path that says we have to consider this, and we have to consider the way to that.
Also, just to add to that, in Luke Van de Wee's book, he does go through tragedies, novels, apocrypha gospels to look for that, and he doesn't find it. So yeah, he spent a lot of time trying to find control groups to compare it to.
I mean, yeah, I don't know if there's been any like studies. And I'm sorry, Ricky, if you wanted to jump.
No, go ahead.
I'm not trying to dominate everything.
No,
but
please.
I mean, like, I don't know if there's been like any like onomastic studies of like, the novels or anything like that. If we're talking about names, we're talking about the personal names in there, you say, okay.
Yeah, he looked at the tragedies, novels, and he did find onomastic congruence in places like, I think, Plutarch, Josephus. I can't remember the other one, but it was like other like biographical information.
That's fine. Particularly with respect to the novels, I guess when I said verisimilitude, I was just speaking in general, like in terms of like geography. Like, for example, Longus, Daphnis, and Chloe. A lot of scholars today believe that he must have been from that island because, you know, there's some accurate detail in there. So, I mean, that's okay. And I get that. Like, I feel like as a skeptic, I'm okay with that. But to me, it's more like, and I know you're saying it's like a piece of the puzzle, but to me, it's like, how much does it really prove? I mean, if the authors of the Gospels, whoever they were, and we'll probably get to authorship here in a minute, but the authors of the Gospels, whoever they were, if they were from the region and they knew a lot about the region, it's the people, the kinds of people that live there, the kind of names that they had, the customs that they had, a lot of the topography. I'm totally okay with that. To me, that doesn't really tell me anything.
You'd expect that level of like familiarity with like the
it doesn't tell me anything significant.
Locations. Like you'd expect the authors to be familiar with those things.
Right.
It's like and I hate to lean on the Spider-Man analogy that I'm sure we're all sick and tired of. But it's kind of the same thing. Like, yeah, Spider-Man is set in New York. The author clearly knows that's a real place. It's kind of that. Like, yeah, the authors of the Gospels knew about Nazareth, they knew about Galilee, they knew the locations, they knew the names that were common in the areas at the time. And so was Josephus. And that doesn't do a lot to encourage reliance on what's being accounted in these books. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But Josephus was also in their study, and Josephus got a much, much lower percentage. I think
he was in their study. What do you mean?
So the study looked at the actual study.
Okay.
Yeah.
What was it? Less than 10? I think Josephus is less than 10.
The way it looks is Josephus was at 6%. Basically, if you were to go through Jerusalem and ask 100 people, there is a 6% chance that you would get the naming pattern in Josephus. That's how Wilson explained it to me. If you go through Jerusalem, you have an 86% chance you get the naming pattern you get in the Gospels. And I think what that says is it's not just that they were from the region. It's that it seems as though these are the kinds of things you would expect if they were getting stories from the stories they were getting were eyewitness accounts from people who actually did these things or said these things to Jesus or had these conversations. Again, it's like if you're trying to make a novel on something, personal interactions. If you're trying to make a novel, they use those in the control group. They get a 0% chance of, even when they had knowledge of, like, the guy they used in the study, they used the guy who wrote the book The Spear, who said he went to the Library of Congress and read everything he could on that time in this place to try to make it as realistic as possible. He got a 0% chance. So I think what they're trying to say is it's more than they're just from the region. These seem to be stories that were actually told, coming from people that actually interacted with Jesus and the disciples.
But if we're talking about the authorship of the Gospels, like, Josephus doesn't do much to speak to that.
It's just general. It's general about the area, the people, and those that are interacting with. Because Josephus,
so he uses the name Matthew or Mattathias or Levi or Yohanan,
correct,
in his writings. He uses a lot more names too.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like he also accounts that some people, even though they were eyewitnesses, would change their stories in order to flatter the Romans or express their hatred towards the Jews. So when they use these names, and what are they saying about them? Like, yeah, they use these names, okay, but what is being said about them? You can run the numbers and take these names and cut them out and say, oh, he uses these names a bunch of times, and statistically that makes it align more with the Gospels. But what is he saying about these names? You see him picking up what I'm putting down?
Yeah, I think I get what you're saying, but isn't it odd that comparatively, if you take the apocryphal and pseudo accounts that are claiming also to be in that area, interacting with these people, watching these miracles and teachings, wouldn't it stand to reason that they would be somewhat closer rather than getting a 0 and a 2%? Wouldn't it be more likely that they are up there with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? See, it points to something of the interaction of the people, because if the eyewitness testimonies of the Gospels are simply that, it requires more than just Matthew, Mark, and Luke and John. And that's my issue, because two of those Gospel writers weren't eyewitnesses at all to begin with. Mark and Luke were not eyewitnesses. So they're taking into account many people. Now, if they have received information from these individuals, men and women, and you're corroborating these stories, there should be a pattern of consistency with what happened, with who, what was said to who, and where was it said. And there should be that consistency in these patterns. And I think that's what Luke and Wilson are trying to point out, is the consistency here. You go to the pseudo gospels and there's no consistency at all. There's no pattern at all. It's completely fabricated. So if the gospels are completely fabricated and somebody's making it up, we can understand if there was a number like 30% to the gospels, the canonical gospels, to 22%, the non-canonical gospels or something like that. We say, wow, that's really, really close. But we're talking 85+% to less than 4. And to me, that points to something that needs to be investigated. I'm not even so sure that, to answer maybe Eric, your point is more needs to be done. I'm always for that.
Yeah.
I'm always for further testing. I'm always for further methodology, and maybe those numbers come down a little bit.
Just real quick, just so people know, Luke Vandewey and Jason Wilson are continuing this research. They're planning other studies that are coming out. So yeah, that they're definitely continuing this work, and they're going to keep trying to refine the methodology to see if anything changes, for sure.
Yeah, I think that's part of the plan, is that it's a theory, and it's just identifying a major number. And that number, I'm sure, will change as more methodologies are applied to it. And I'm sure they're willing to change their number. I don't think they're dogmatically sitting on it. But that's a big gap. That's a really big gap.
Yeah, I think this is where, some of the other features of the Gospels that, skeptics and apologists debate when it comes to like their reliability come into play. Because I mean, like I said, I'm totally okay with, that level of verisimilitude. Like, even if the authors of the Gospels knew people with those names, and they knew the region, they knew the topography, that doesn't really, like I said, it doesn't seem all that significant to me. It doesn't really do very much to tell me that, the stories that we're hearing, that the events that they're narrating are actually true. It doesn't increase that probability by very much, I think. Because,
so let me ask it this way, maybe this will help, Eric. I don't know. Would you say that the Gospel of Thomas is in the same boat as Matthew? Would you say that okay, so you would say what sets them apart? What sets an account like Matthew's account, or just pick any of the 4, versus any of like the Gospel of Mary, Thomas, the Gospel of Truth?
A lack of narrative.
Well, I think we might even agree on what I'm getting ready to say. I think that what distinguishes a gospel like Matthew from these other gospels is the fact that the Gospel of Matthew is probably earlier, and the author of the Gospel of Matthew was more familiar, more in contact with the region and with the people there than the authors of these later Gospels. I don't think that really changes like the mode of composition. You know what I mean? Like, because ancient writers, whether they were historians or novelists or biographers or whatever the case, like you want to include like details that, are give like local coloring. And if you couldn't, because you were from somewhere else and you had no idea what you were talking about, though, that's fine. I mean, historians today, we can look at that and say, hey, look, this guy has no idea what he's talking about. He must not have been from the region. Sure. He's totally making this up. But I don't really see a strong correlation between, hey, we got some really accurate names here and some really accurate geography, topography, and the stories are true. I mean, like, we have examples from.
Totally agree. I think you're right. That does not mean they're true. What we're arguing is that this shows that what the Gospels were writing were reliable accounts delivered to them from the eyewitnesses, or that they were eyewitnesses themselves. So like when Mark or Luke is writing, it's clear that they would be actually talking to eyewitnesses and actual stories that about Jesus. Now, that doesn't prove miracles are true. Like Lydia McGrew says this in her book on the Undesigned Coincidences. What she basically argues is this is evidence that these go back to eyewitnesses.
Right.
So if you're taking the 3 criteria that Augustine of Hippo gives when it comes to investigating original authorship of historical texts, right? He gives 3, and I think I got them in order. Contemporary support is a big one that he has. So that's part of the attestation that Michael was bringing up at the very, very beginning. The other one is taking information, corroborating it over time. And to us, this point would land in that category because now you have information, you have data, you're doing the research, you're doing the statistics, and now you're able to corroborate that with other evidence of that period, like inscriptions, discoveries of locations and towns that were once denied as existing. Like that's a big one going on right now with Nazareth. There was this big push once about, oh, there was no Nazareth. That's not even a place. It's just a people, it was a group. And now there's actually excavations going on. Now they're saying, well, maybe there was a Nazareth. We have these inscriptions. We found this pottage. Even Ehrman wrote a blog that defended that there was an actual Nazareth. So now you're able to take that and corroborate it over time. And his third criteria is that you find a chain of evidence that's unbroken. And so when we follow Augustine of Hippo's criteria, we're looking for contemporary support, which I'm sure we're going to get into, but this would fall in category 2. These patterns of statistics, they're a part of that corroborating multiplicity of evidence into one coherent argument. And you said it well a minute ago, Eric. It's a piece to the puzzle, and it doesn't prove, Jesus actually said, "Blessed are," and then you fill in the blank in the Sermon on the Mount. It doesn't necessarily prove that he actually said those things, and it doesn't prove that he took the lame and made him whole, or took somebody with leprosy and made him completely clean. No, we wouldn't argue that. And from that perspective, what it does is it gives us a foundation to start searching. Where do we find reliability? Where can we find consistency? Where is a pattern of witness that shows an understanding of the people, the places, the things that happen that would involve human dialogue that actually is real, not made up and fabricated in fairy tale? And that eliminates a lot of playing field. And it keeps us within Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and even in the study in Acts. And now we can say, all right, we have people who know the area. It eliminates a lot, and it centers our focus now on the Gospels, where we can actually jump in and have a reason to jump into it rather than just say, oh, it's equal to all these others. Because there are those, and I think you know that, there are those that would say Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Gospel of Truth, Gospel of Mary, Gospel of Peter, they're all one and the same. Well, this actually makes them not one and the same. And I know that's such your argument, but it does give us a place to start, if you would.
Yeah, I think so. I guess this is probably going to lead to other things, like, for example, like the kind of literature that the Gospels are, their genre and so forth, and what their actual literary project is. But Michael, when you say, like, I agree with you. I don't think that you're arguing that, oh, hey, look, they got these names and all this other stuff, therefore they're true. Like, I wouldn't caricature your position that way. I'm just saying that I don't think that proves that they're based on eyewitness testimony, that the authors are genuinely, trying to relay to their readers. I mean, because I think you can have all that stuff because authors in the ancient world would be motivated to include those sorts of details if they had access to it, which I think that the authors of the Gospels did. I mean, like I don't think that, some guy in the diaspora was, just sat down one day and was like, hey, I'm just going to write up a narrative about, what happened in first century Palestine. And he just miraculously got a lot of these details right, maybe with a few errors here and there, whatever. I don't think that that's plausible at all. But what I do think is that even if all that is true, it doesn't tell us that the authors of the Gospels were faithfully recording eyewitness testimony. I think you can still invent things,
sure,
even with this level of verisimilitude. And I think there's good reasons to think that they were, and I think there's good analogies to that in other ancient historical texts. So maybe we'll get into that here in a minute. But
we don't disagree on that, by the way. That it doesn't it doesn't prove the whole thing. It eliminates a playing field, though, as far as what's worth investigating.
And I would say, like, and one of the things that Wilson and Van de Wey challenge on is like, let's find a novel where someone actually got onomastic congruence. Like, the only ones he can find is like actual like lives that were also like they mentioned Plutarch's Life of Caesar got onomastic congruence, or in living footnotes in the Gospel of Luke, or Josephus, he got onomastic. Like, yeah, I definitely could see somebody could invent stories, but when we see examples of them trying to do that from various aspects, we don't get that aspect of sorry, the tongue twister right there, I just completely dropped, but that appearance of truth. So that is a kind of he calls it an historical tell. Like, you can kind of like tell if like he's looked through numerous examples. He just can't find any novels, fictional things where you're going to get that. This is at least a tell that something is at play here that is likely to go back to eyewitnesses. It's not a proof. You're absolutely right.
It's patterns. I mean, we do this with the Gospels. What is the likelihood that there's a Matthean priority versus a Markan priority? We look for patterns.
Yeah.
And so it's another pattern that leads us to, okay, this Gospel is probably dependent on this one here, and this was the big Matthean Markan priority argument for years, still is, unfortunately, but it's still happening. But it's these kinds of things that show patterns to go, okay, well, this is the likability, or this is the probability that this is actually happening. So I kind of basing into this, Eric. So your point is accuracy. Out of the 4 Gospels, which one would you say you find the biggest issue with? As it relates to what you said about reliability or storytelling or miracles or whatever patterns that you struggle with on consistency of telling narrative. Out of the 4, which one do you find the most struggle? Do you struggle with the most?
I mean, that's a good question.
That is a good question.
Really, it's really all of them, if I'm not lying. But if I had to pick one, it would probably be either Matthew or John.
So, like, why don't we get one? We've been talking a little about while for onomastic congruence. Do you guys want to propose argument against reliability?
Well, okay. So one of the things that I wanted to bring up was, how do you define reliability? Like, when you say reliability, what do you mean when you say that?
Oh, let me get this. I think when it comes to the issue of reliability, it's not a yes or no question. Is it reliable or not? It's much more on a spectrum, and I like to call it the weirdness spectrum. Is it weird that this happened? Yes or no? So when it comes to like the Gospels, you can't like lump the Bible as reliable or not. That's a huge mistake, because there's so many different books, so many different narratives. You got to like study each one individually and grade it on that scale. It comes the same thing with the Gospels. Each individual narrative within each individual Gospel needs to be graded on this scale. Each story, each sentence, needs to be looked. And when you start looking at studying the manuscripts that we have, even like individual words and individual letters, we have to figure out, was this the right letter to use? Was this the right word to use?
Sure.
So it becomes a much more complicated than saying, is it reliable or not? So it's a difficult issue to tackle, and that's why scholars do what they do, is to try and solve these mysteries.
I would say,
and that's, by the way, without any, you can do the Thomas Jefferson thing and cut out all the miracle claims out of the Bible. You can take all those out. That still applies. Like Jesus' trial before Pilate, that probably would not have happened the way it happened. Jesus clearing out the temple probably would not have happened the way it happened. Jesus being granted an honorable burial by Pilate probably would not have happened. Jesus offering Barnabas to be released instead of Jesus. There's no record of anything like that. So when you take these just individual stories that have no separate, wow, word. Let me try that again. Mommy made me mash my M&Ms. Okay, we're good now. When you take any of those narratives, you have to grade them on that scale. Like, is this story, even though it's just a regular story and bears no supernatural claims to them, would this likely have happened? Some of them, yeah, maybe there's a nugget of truth to them. I have no problem admitting that. some of them, it's not very likely based on what we know about that period in ancient history.
So
yeah, not. Hopefully, y'all are picking up what I'm putting down.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, answer your question, Eric. Going back to is, I would say that when we mean reliable, we'd say that the Gospels report, in terms of the gist, likely what were the original stories about Jesus that were the eyewitnesses themselves were saying. So we would say, sure, we can't prove beyond a shadow of doubt that Jesus fed the 5,000, but it seems based on the data, the eyewitnesses were reporting that this happened. Sure, we can't prove that Jesus rose from the dead, but based on the earliest reports, it seems there were women who discovered the tomb empty on Sunday morning. So that's what I would say. And see, this is sort of like a two-step process for Christians. First, as someone who's more of a maximalist and not a minimalist, I would say first I want to argue the Gospels are reliable, that these are going back to eyewitnesses. Then I would make a resurrection argument as this next step. So like we're just talking about the first step here, though.
So when you say reliable, what you basically mean is that the authors are faithfully reporting what at least they believed were genuine eyewitness accounts.
Yeah.
Basically. Okay. Because I don't know. I guess people work with different definitions of reliability. When I think of reliability, I think of something like, okay, so we can verify enough of what an author says to know that when it comes to a point in the narrative or in the text where we can't verify it, we can have some reasonable confidence that it's true or that it's probably true or at least plausible because we have all this other evidence that makes this author reliable. Like in the same way we would think anybody else is reliable. Like, well, I rely on you because you've proven in the past that you can be trusted, you know?
Yeah.
So as far as like the eyewitness thing, I think this will kind of take us into like the genre of the Gospels, like, because I don't know, like, I think there's a lot of stories in the Gospels that sort of betray the idea that they're based on eyewitness testimony. And I think that the kind of literary project that the Gospels are carrying out don't really support the idea that they're just sort of engaging in some kind of like really faithful historiography where they're just, you know, they're going out and they're talking to the eyewitnesses and just reporting what the eyewitnesses said. I don't think that is supported by any of the data. Go ahead.
I was going to say, how about we do a couple of super chats, then you can give us some examples of what you mean.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. So thank you, Lil Joseph's thoughts on Enoch having Christological prophecies like Son of Man being pre-existent, enthroned, and bringing salvation and judgment. So I did a video on Enoch a while back, and just to be clear, the book of Enoch identifies Enoch as the Son of Man. I don't know. Ricky, didn't you do something on this? Like you talked about Enoch at one point?
Yeah, I did. It's been a while. Yeah, Son of Man is a much more generic term than it may sound. It basically just means like son of a Jew or
it can, yeah,
son of a person. Like it's kind of like the term Messiah. The term Messiah can be applied to like Solomon, King David, Moses was called Messiah in the wilderness. It's a much more generic term than we tend to think. So Son of Man, it can apply to anything. Not anything, but it's a much more broad term than it's not unique to Jesus is what I'm.
Yeah. Ezekiel calls himself a son of man, and it's just,
right.
He means a son of man. Yeah. It's when Daniel, you get that prophecy and it now becomes this divine figure that, that's actually came up in the Alex O'Connor, David Wood debate a lot. They were talking a lot about that and how it's used in the New Testament.
Well, we have to keep this in mind too. Enoch specifically in book 1, because there's more than one book, and within book 1, there's 5 books within book 1 of First Enoch, and some of the sections of Enoch are probably post New Testament.
I was about to say, isn't Enoch like dated to at the earliest the 1st century BCE?
Some of them,
like the book of Enoch is not as early as.
No.
Some of them are pre-Christ. There's sections that are certainly post-Messiah. So it's difficult. The Dead Sea Scrolls perhaps could be a part of the argument here, but most of the Ethiopic texts that are more fuller are definitely portions that seem to be post Christianity. So you can see influences there. And then you got second Enoch as well. So then you got to deal with that. And you got third Enoch. So you're going to have to deal with multiple Enochs here. And those are definitely later on. So even in first Enoch, which seems like book one is probably, because you got different sections of parables and so forth. So book one seems to be probably earliest of the group. And book one within book one is the earliest of the five within book one. Mm-hmm. And it's so confusing because there's 5 books within book one. And so the first of the 5 is probably the earliest. And then in the later, you start finding major Christian influence. And then it goes back to more of an ancient. So it's major very hard to identify the dating to begin with.
Well, I'm speaking from memory here, but if I'm not mistaken, like as far as like the Book of the Watchers in First Enoch, I think that's the earliest section. I think the earliest parts of that go back to like the 3rd century, maybe like the beginning of the 3rd century. And as far as like the Son of Man stuff, I think that most of that, if not all of it, is concentrated in the similitudes of Enoch. And I think a lot of scholars think that that's 1st century or contemporary with the writings of the
Christian. It seems to be Christian influenced. It is.
Yeah.
And even if you just look at like what the Hebrew Bible says about Enoch in Genesis, like 3, it just says Enoch was with God and then he wasn't, or something like that. That's like all it says about Enoch. So what happened was ancient Jews took that story and like expanded upon it and like made the Book of Enoch.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not an expert here. I'm not going to like try to speak authoritatively.
Yeah, again, I'm going off memory, so take everything I say with a grain.
We don't have to spend too much time.
Right, but I'm sorry. I don't think that this. I don't know if the general view is that the similitudes of Enoch are heavily influenced by Christianity at all. Just to push back against you. See, I'm not sure. Yeah. I'm just throwing that out there. I don't think that's the case. That may be contemporary.
I want Eric and Ricky to answer this one. How to respond to the claim that Jesus is an alien?
Oh God.
That's what I was looking for. That response right there.
Don't do that. Don't do that.
Listen, there is powerful evidence that Jesus was an alien, and you need to refute it.
I think there may be some allusion here to Richard Carrier and how he constructs like the cosmology of antiquity and how basically what we would think of as supernatural beings were back then. In our terms,
Carrier, though, this idea is much older than Carrier. Carrier just kind of like fantasized it. What's the word I'm thinking of? Made it more mainstream, sensationalized. Yes, thank you, wife. He more sensationalized the idea. But yeah, this idea is much older, and it's just don't do that.
I'd say there's no evidence in the Gospels of Jesus.
I don't mean to turn a
planet. So,
I don't mean to turn a $5 super chat into $100 from the Enoch, but just to clarify, so that we're not accused of anything. Book 1, Watchers, Parables. Book 2, Heavenly Luminaries, Dreams, and Enoch in his epistle. So. Because I just had to pull my notes up in this because I did a whole lecture on this a couple of years ago, and I still have the notes here. So in section 37, or chapters 37 to 71, that's the book of the parables. That is where the term Son of Man is used. I have in my notes, he's described as sitting on a throne of glory for the final judgment. Many scholars deny an early date due to its overly Christian influence within the narratives. And we also don't have anything earlier than the 1st century from Greek or from the Hebrew, whereas with the Watchers, we do have 2nd and 3rd century, or 1st and 2nd century BC, and then even later on with the Luminaries, we have 2nd BC fragments in Qumran. So, Eric, the Luminaries is a part of actually a 2nd century BC. It's the parables that have the Christian influence teachings, which mention the Son of Man. So, just to clarify, so we're not all wrong. I wanted to make sure we clarified. And sorry, we turned that. I'll put another $5 in, Michael. I'll put another $5 in.
So. You see, Ricky is running from the powerful arguments. You see, sorry, that's the Dawa voice coming out.
Well, we were all kind of just going off the memory, so it's like, well, I've got notes on this. I might as well just pull it up and just make life easy.
That's just something I have to look into and study. I haven't really gotten to that literature. So.
Fun stuff.
So this is in reference to a super chat I put in on David Wood's stream, telling people to come over here. I said y'all, and apparently I did it wrong. So sorry, Pendragon. I didn't mean to ruin your whole day.
I must have
I
missed
said
this.
when
What
you're all
happened?
done, come over to our stream, and I put a super chat in so people would. So also David Wood sends his regards. Excellent. Can't watch this live, but I'll chip it anyway. Well, thank you. Come back and finish it later. Thank you, John Lee, for gifting one Inspiring Philosophy membership. Solar X PvP says the chance that I get a correct distribution of the 2020 names while writing a 2020 story is low. I think it's evidence the people weren't fake. So that's what he says there. Anyone want to comment on that? I think we kind of hit that. We beat that horse for a while. I think we can move on. Came from David Wood stream. Give him his royalties. Will do. So with that, let's get back into this. Eric, why don't you bring up your point you wanted to make about issues you see as them not being eyewitness testimony?
Okay. And I think a lot of this has to do with like the genre of the Gospels, because, in the contemporary scene, you see a lot of scholarship on the Gospels being biographies. And I think a lot of Christian apologetics, that's interpreted not necessarily by the scholars who are advocating this themselves, but by a lot of apologists who are sort of taking this argument and running with it. They think that by being biographies, the Gospels that automatically increases the probability that they're relaying historical events from eyewitnesses. Under the assumption that biographies are basically a subcategory of historiography. And when you look at the Gospels and you look at ancient historiographical literature, because that's what this is really about, right? Like if the authors of the Gospels are trying to relay historical events, they would do that in the ways that ancient people would relay historical events. So it's, they're not going to come up with, some sort of new genre of anything. Their understanding of history is going to be like an ancient understanding of history, and they're going to write history in the way that the ancients would sort of write history. And so I don't think that when you really look at the Gospels, they don't really line up with sort of more elite historiographical biographical literature. And the reason why I say that is because, and Michael, you and I have talked about this before on the phone. There's this, this is really what it comes down to. Like, there's just a lot of like fabulous content in there. And I think it's important to point out that if the authors of the Gospels were participating in any kind of ancient historiographical discourse, then we would expect the gospel text to read a lot differently than they actually do. Like, for example, like, I don't know, maybe we have like the Lucan preface, for example, and maybe a few scattered remarks in John about, the writings of an eyewitness or something like that. But like, there's really not a lot there. The Gospels, like when you look at ancient historiography, and in light of this, this sort of concept of miracle, like ancient historiographers really sort of, they downplayed that aspect of the narratives. Like, they didn't really, like, miracles were like marginal in their accounts. Like a lot of the fabulous content, like, they didn't really endorse it, in their own authorial persona. They would say, hey, look, this is reported. I got this from this source. This is the tradition. This is the mythical account. And the Gospels just sort of go at it. They're just like, hey, right at the beginning, Jesus meets Satan in the desert, and it's not just miracles either. Like, a lot of divine beings that would have been considered, like maybe mythological, just show up like frequently in the narrative. Satan appears. Moses and Elijah appear. That'd be like
Heracles rising in, was it Matthew 21?
Yeah, that would be like Heracles and Romulus showing up in a biography of Caesar. Or, God himself appears at one point during the Transfiguration. And, Jesus ascends to heaven in the plain sight of the participants in the narrative. He's resurrected from the dead. His tomb is found empty. Like, these are all like heavily mythical tropes that the ancient historians would have recognized as such. And they would have marked off as such and said, hey guys, like, I know this this is just this is just the tradition. This is just what I've heard. This is just what was reported. But I'm not necessarily saying that this stuff is true. And the Gospels don't really do anything like that. So it seems that they're more written for like more indulgent audiences, maybe audiences that are more reliant on like Jewish scriptural texts, ancient myths.
Attuned to.
Yeah, and they just sort of accept it. There's no like real historical
and that's the thing with ancient literature. Like we'll use the phrase today, like they made this up or they fabricated it. In the ancient world, this was common practice. People did this all the time. I think it was Richard C. Miller found like 120 other empty tomb narratives, and Robin Faith Walsh found like 50 more when looking at other Latin texts from around the same period or later. But these like miracle claims were common at the time. They were expected. It wasn't to be alive 2,000 years ago and being able to read these things. It wouldn't be a weird thing to read. Like the stories in the Gospels about Jesus were not unique. They were very common.
Well, it sounds like you're saying two different things. So if I understand it correct, Eric, you're saying that the Gospels are doing things that are not in keeping with ancient historical biographies. And Ricky, it sounds like you're saying that they are playing into all the regular tropes of the time. So do you guys differ on this a little bit?
I don't know. Do we, Eric?
Maybe. I mean, I'm not.
I want to answer you both. I don't want to pin you against or in agreement when you're not saying the same thing. Because the way I understood you, Eric, is you're saying that there's major differences from regular biographies that are going on at that time. And from Ricky, it sounds like you're saying that they just copy pasted what normal standard was for that time. So
from biographies, yes, Eric's right. Okay. From like historical narrative is what I'm arguing from. Which it's hard to place the Gospels in one of those two categories.
Okay, so let's take a couple examples of. I don't like personally, Eric, when Christian apologists just throw out they're ancient biographies. Well, yes, they are, but that's too general. It's kind of like what Ricky was talking about earlier. You have statements about the Gospels. Well, it's too general. We got to get into specifics. There are different writing patterns from Luke to Mark. Very, very, very different. The style is different. An aspect that John chooses not to use that the synoptics do is something that even conservative and liberal scholars have no problem agreeing on, that what Jesus did with the teaching of parables is seemingly inventive on his part. Because prior to the Gospels, we don't have parabolic teaching the way that we see Jesus doing parables. This is one of the biggest reasons, and it's just
you don't see that from Philo?
To the way Jesus taught parables?
Did Philo not use parables?
Not in the manner Jesus did.
No, not the amount either. No.
I mean, that would kind of depend on how much antiquity you would attribute to like the, rabbinic lore, I suppose.
But the rabbis weren't using parabolic. They were not using what Jesus was doing. We have no rabbinical preservation of parabolic teachings in the manner that Jesus did parabolic teachings. His was almost inventive in a way. And so this is the point, because from that point forward, we start seeing parables show up everywhere. Hence, we have a whole section in First Enoch that is called the Book of Parables. And most conservative Christian scholars wouldn't even give it any earlier in the first century. Most would put it in the second century CE, because it seems to be mimicking the pattern of parables. We start seeing parables become a major thing that starts happening after Jesus' teachings. So, but
some portions in Enoch are dated to like the 3rd century BCE.
Not the parables. And that was my point. The parable section is from chapter 70. What did I just say it was a minute ago? I had it up a minute ago. 37 to 71. So it ends there. In these sections, we don't have anything earlier in the first century on. We do have 2nd century and 3rd century CE attestation for. Whereas the luminaries, we have a 2nd century fragment in Qumran, whereas in Watchers, we have 1st and 2nd century BC attestation for. But when you get to the book of the parables, which is book 3 of First Enoch, we don't have anything like that. And this is where even conservative scholars would say, this is much, much later. The parabolic teaching of Jesus seemed to springboard a new genre. So even if the Gospels are seen as ancient biographies, as they are patterning themselves with the story of Jesus, they're using different techniques that had to come from somewhere.
You say that the teachings of Jesus in the form of parables springboard this genre, but then you say that the early church fathers never used parables in their teachings.
No.
How do you square those? Did I hear that wrong?
No. That's where you start seeing parable teachings moving forward from them from the New Testament to the fathers and other Christian writings. You start seeing parabolic teaching as a pattern. It's more 2nd, 3rd century, but we don't see this in the 2nd and 3rd century BC is what I'm getting at. For example, when you go to the Old Testament, how many Old Testament rabbinical teachings or prophetic teachings involve parables? Maybe somebody could make the argument of Nathan approaching David and saying, you are the man, using the analogy of a sheep and stealing somebody's sheep and cooking it for dinner for guests. And then boom, you're the man. Maybe, but Jesus was regularly teaching parables. And then you have to come up with the fact that these 3 different gospels that teach the parabolic teachings of Jesus have new teachings that are distinct from each other. So if the parables are a new invention in the first or late first or early 2nd century, yes, they share some of the same parables, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but then Luke has certain parables that the others don't, like the prodigal son or the Good Samaritan. And then you have other parables in Matthew that are not found, particularly in money and ideas like that are not in Luke and that are not in Mark, or expanded parables. So you have to give an occasion to the rise of this new genre. Even though they're considered biographies, there's still different written techniques within these biographies. Parables has to be explained. Where did the rise and origin of parables come? Are there forms of it used prior? Sure. I remember actually talking to Dr. Kip Davis. He's a good friend of mine. And he does not agree with me on the Gospels, but I remember never heard of him. He and I were talking about parables, and he even conceded that it's very likely that Jesus,
love you, Kip.
He's a good dude. But one of the things that he conceded was it is very possible that the parables were something that Jesus started in the way that we see him in the Gospels. I think he came up with the possibility of, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's 2 potential sections that would be considered parabolic. And he gave me those both references. I can go back and look for them if you'd like me to. But those were still questioned as whether they'd be considered parable in the sense that we see in the New Testament. So he was even will concede that Jesus may have been starting something new. And if it wasn't Jesus, and these writers are not eyewitnesses who didn't actually hear these things, then we have to give credit to all 3 gospel writers to working together to start something new that starts a pattern of technique for other writers after them. And not only are they going to be copying each other, but adding nuances and having their own creative, unique parables different from each other, like the Good Samaritan, the prodigal son for Luke compared to Matthew and Mark. So I guess my question with bringing that up to both of you is, yes, they are biographies. I don't like when that's where it's left, blanket statement. They're biographies that contain realities too. And we have to understand, is this radical that a healing would be emphasized? Yes. But we also see the possibility of radical teaching that was never seen before in Israel either, parables. So new things are happening in the Gospels. We're not even denying that that's the possibility here, but that seems to be a pattern with Jesus.
So one thing, the miracles would not be new.
No.
Maybe the parabolic teachings were more new than the miracles, even as far as narrative is concerned. So what? I'm not even sure what I'm asking now.
I don't know. I guess I'm not really sure what that proves. First of all, I'm not very certain on the fact that it's some sort of novelty.
The rise of a certain literary trend is not necessarily.
But then, even if it was, I'm not really sure that that you could.
Yeah, I'd have to look up
Jesus. Maybe I mean I don't know. I don't really know what that's supposed to prove at all.
Well, I think going back to your point, Eric, is I think we agree these are not like sophisticated biographies. These were clearly written to teach like the popular or the common man. So I wouldn't expect them to constantly be breaking away to talk about sources like all the time or getting really technical, like you can see Herodotus doing at times. I think what I'm not saying Herodotus wrote a biography. I'm just using him as an example. I think what we're trying to get at, though, is like, yeah, they're biographies, but I mean, even Christopher Pelling says biography is a very broad category. Like,
right, I agree.
There are popular, there are sophisticated. I think these were popular biographies written for people to help teach. So yeah, there's going to be differences with the sophisticated biographies for sure. There's going to be aspects of the Gospels that are wholly unique, and there's going to be aspects of the Gospels that are going to have similarities with some of the books of like the Old Testament, like Nehemiah or Esther, for example. That's right. Run. He's running. You see the power of my dawa. No, never mind. Sorry, that's what happens. But I think so. Just to summarize, yeah, I totally agree. Like, yeah, there's going to be differences, but I don't think that necessarily moves all the evidence that like Richard Burridge has given that these do at least fall into that broad category of biography.
Right, but given the fact that it's a spectrum, like that sets different expectations, right? Like if the Gospels are these sort of popular biographies that are not like these, more critical, historiographical biographies like Plutarch or something like that. Like we have to sort of alter how we interpret them, because if they have like all this, for example, fabulous content, and they're not really making a case like, hey, you guys, like this really happened, and they write a whole preface explaining their methodology, like why they're including this stuff, despite the fact that this isn't really typical of how ancient history was written. Like, I think that sort of changes our expectations about how to receive them, because it to my thinking, like, all this stuff about, the miraculous, the fabulous content could really serve like some of the purposes that you name, like didactic purposes, maybe even some entertainment there, like just to draw attention to the sort of ethos, the sort of teachings, that the Christians are trying to push, and that maybe you're not supposed to take it too seriously. You're not supposed to take it as, oh, this is what really happened. This is the gospel truth, and I really don't see how we can really, I really don't see how you, as a Christian apologist who supports the historicity of the stories in the Gospels, can really, get around that. I mean, I don't know. Like, I mean, how can you really say that that's not what they were doing? You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, like, I would use a lot of other independent evidence because they're not doing things like the sophisticated biographers were doing. That's why I brought up things like onomastic congruence. We can bring up other aspects as well, like that we had covered throughout the 15-part series there. So, I mean, like, yeah, I think their main goal, the gospel writers were doing, is they want to teach the life and the story of Jesus to the church. And then they come with historical tells, to borrow language from Luke Vandewey, that are going to support reliability. But I totally agree. These are not sophisticated biographies, like in line with like Suetonius, for example, or like Plutarch, where you're gonna do that kind of stuff. These were mainly written to teach Christians or people that did not have a very deep education or probably couldn't even read for themselves. But I don't think that's a huge issue. I guess I don't think that is a major problem, because there are other things that seems to be just a neutral point. There are other things that we look at to support reliability.
And I would say that Luke's probably one of the few of the Gospels that actually tries to put together something that's resembling a more ancient. Because, I mean, even his pattern of the very beginning, I mean, he's using his opening and his preface very similar to how you see some of the other prefaces long before him in more of the classical writings. We don't see that in Mark, for example. It just kind of jumps right into the scene.
Right.
Which kind of speaks to its conception, which speaks to the historical attestation about its conception. It is exactly what you would expect to see in an account that's being talked about by the church fathers and how it's constructed, where it wasn't some major line scholar or historian sitting down who's taking in all this really deep stuff and then just writing it on out. It seems to be very loose at times, very abrupt at times. I mean, honestly, they would flunk most Greek courses if they had to take that to their professor and say, hey, I've written an account of something. They would say, you need to go back and fix this because it's too choppy and it's not, there's a lot of run on going on in here. And so when you look at Mark's gospel, it doesn't look like it's as coherent and as well organized and put together as Luke's. And so, but to me, that doesn't show like, well, my goodness, you know, these things are terrible. To me, it shows the authenticity of what we see in the attestation part, which was Michael was referring to earlier, and how they said Mark came into existence to begin with. It's the exact way I would expect it to be if what the church fathers and the patristics in these early documents are telling us about the origin and conception of Mark's gospel. It's exactly the way I would expect it to look. And it resembles.
But I guess what I'm saying is, in light of the fact that they include the sort of content that they do, and they weren't these sort of sophisticated historiographical texts, like how can you really know that they really expected their readers to understand, like, hey, this stuff really happened? And, you know, they weren't really like, you know, just really asking their readers to like indulge in the tales. You know, and it's not really a serious historiographical sort of narrative that they were trying to paint.
Well, I don't know. Like, I mean, Luke said that when he was writing the Theophilus, that he put together an orderly account.
But that's very minimal, right? I mean, like if you look at other historiographical prefaces and, you know, sort of the commentary that ancient historians and biographers provide for their texts, like Luke's is very minimal by comparison. It doesn't even seem like for example, he doesn't even tell us what his sources are, or, you know, he doesn't distinguish. You said what?
Or does he?
I mean, I feel like
he says he compiled an account from eyewitnesses so that you, Theophilus, will have a detailed account.
But he uses techniques. He uses techniques all through his gospel and in Acts to show you who exactly he was getting his information from.
I mean, but does he though? I mean, like, how do you think he does that in a way?
He doesn't name anybody that he's getting this information from, though.
Sure.
I mean, later in Acts, he starts using the personal pronouns, the we.
Well, because he's telling you that he was actually in those accounts, whereas in Luke's gospel, he wouldn't be able to tell you that. And that's, again, consistent with what we're told, that he was not an eyewitness of Jesus. And he admits as much in the first part of the book. Yeah. But for example, if you take the two disciples on the road of Emmaus, what he uses a technique when he's dealing with these two disciples, he only names one, Cleopas. He silences the name of the other. You see no disclosure of the name. This is a common technique. Why? Because it's not because he didn't know who it was, or if he was fabricating the account, you would naturally make up both people's names that would be there.
What do you mean that was a common technique?
I don't think that's the case.
What do you think?
That's the case? Because if you look at, like, if you actually read, like, you know, like ancient texts that we all agree are fictional, like, you don't get this consistent pattern of, like, if there's a character that shows up in the story that they're going to be named or something like that. Like, that just seems like, I don't know how that's relevant at all.
Well, I'm giving you an example of many. I mean, you go through the same thing. Like if you look in Acts chapter 8, or you look into the story of with Philip. You have the whole story of the Ethiopian and this situation in the desert where he baptized them, etc. Well, then you find out, you think, well, where in the world would he have gotten that from? I mean, how in the world could he have gotten that? Well, then the we, us, and our passages that Ricky was referring to later when he's with Paul, the we, us, and our guy, whoever he is, we would assume him to be Luke. He's in Caesarea with Philip and his virgin daughters. He crosses paths with him. So naturally, he would have gotten that information from his journey with Paul, running into this man later in the book. Again, the point is that if you go through his pattern of how he does things, introducing people's names in specific situations, it seems like there was some sort of contact. I mean, if you compare him and how he does this in his Gospels, how he does this in Luke, or I mean, it's how he does this in Acts after Luke, you have this continual pattern. When you look at the disciple on the road of Emmaus, I'm giving you an example. You have two people there. He discloses Cleopas's name specifically. He does the same thing at the tomb. He lists a woman that's not mentioned by the other individuals, in addition to the other women that are mentioned by Mark and mentioned by Matthew. But he specifically focuses on one individual's viewpoint that is different from Matthew's personal person who's apparently telling the story from his perspective, or Mark's from his perspective. They each identify women that are distinct, and there's an involvement around them, because then you find their story earlier in his book. And that's what I'm saying. You find their stories earlier on, and then you kind of get this revelation later on how they cross paths with each other, how they cross paths with certain eyewitnesses. And now all of a sudden their story earlier in the book makes sense. You see that happen all the time with Mary Magdalene, for example. He tells the story of her being possessed with 7 demons. You go to Mark's gospel, you have nothing about her until the very end.
Does the author of Luke and Acts ever mention the name of Luke at all?
Well, no. Why would he mention his own name there? He wasn't an eyewitness.
He never mentions his name in the first place. The only reason we think it's Luke is because of Irenaeus, like 300 years later.
Well, no.
He never identifies himself as Luke. He never mentions the name as Luke at all. So where is this name Luke coming from?
Well, I mean, like it's on every manuscript of Luke. It's not just Irenaeus, it's other church fathers as well.
When's the earliest manuscript of Luke 1?
I don't remember off the top of my head now. But I mean, like, I don't see that that's relevant to what we're getting at. Okay.
Well, I guess I'm just saying that,
right?
Like these sort of subtle clues that you're finding, Stephen, like I just don't feel like that really corroborates the idea that he's really the author of Luke is really engaging in some sort of serious historical project. Like, why didn't he just make it clear what he was doing? Like other ancient historians would have done that, especially if they were narrating this sort of content.
I guess I'm confused on why you're saying that.
Oh, go ahead. Stephen, real quick. John J. Peters notes this in his book that Luke's prologue really the way Luke writes, and with his prologue, it does sort of follow a similar pattern we see with like Thucydides, for example, and less so Herodotus. So like this does seem to be a way that you could write about historical things in the ancient world. And that's his main point when he discusses the prologue. But go ahead, Stephen.
No, I was going to say he explicitly states his purpose and his method and technique and how he collected these stories. He said he went to the eyewitnesses. I mean, I guess why doubt that?
Identifies himself.
Why would he need to identify himself? He wasn't an eyewitness.
I just don't think he says very much there that can, like if you look at these other, like even Thucydides, first of all, Thucydides wouldn't have endorsed anything that Luke writes, because Thucydides was totally against like narrating like stuff that he would call mythical, which Luke Acts is kind of full of. So if Luke was following some sort of Thucydidean, historiographical model, like, he did a really bad job at that. But, I don't know. I just feel like Luke just kind of he has these first couple of opening sentences about sort of like what he's doing. He doesn't really get into any specifics, and then he just kind of goes into the narrative. And we don't even know who Theophilus. We don't really see what he's doing, what he says that he's doing in this first couple of sentences anywhere throughout the narrative. What we do see is that he's just sort of copying Mark and Matthew, or maybe Q or something like that. Like we don't really see Luke saying like, hey, look, I know, because ancient historians would have read Luke's account and been like, this sounds like this is nonsense. And if Luke was participating in that sort of discourse, he would have known that. And he would have had to apologize for that or account for that in some way. But he really doesn't do that. Like all we get is his first couple of opening sentences in the preface, and then the rest of the narrative just sort of follows. And I really don't think that you can really make much. Like I feel like a lot of apologists hang a lot on this little tiny preface that Luke has at the beginning, but it doesn't bear the weight of what we're actually reading. Like you really can't squeeze much out of it,
because you can't compare it to like Paul, how he introduced his letters. I, Paul, a disciple of Jesus Christ, do convey on to you. Like that's how Paul starts his letters. None of the authors of the Gospels do that. Why?
This is the nature of what, when we say biographies, this is exactly what I think Michael, I don't want to speak for you, is talking about. Paul's letter is an epistle. It's a personal letter of correspondence between himself and an individual or the church, for example. When you have biographies, I think you both know that we have multiple biographies, if you would, ancient biographies, where writers, including Josephus at certain points, leaves himself anonymous or doesn't include himself or speaks of himself in the third person. Xenophon does this. I mean, we have multiple historical Greek writers and Roman writers who do this in technique when they're telling a narrative about somebody else by not including themselves personally into the narrative. That's not a unique thing for the Gospels. We see that in multiple writings in biographical settings that are not just in the Gospels, that are earlier than the Gospels.
And Simon Gathercole's paper on this, I mean, he goes in, he found 2 biographies from the ancient world that were the exception. And one was a fictional biography in the Historia Augusta. The other one was Lucian, who just tacked on his name at the end. I mean, they typically, when they're writing about a sage or a person specifically, they tend to write in this anonymous fashion, because then it just sort of fits in the overall genre. That'd be different than like the letters themselves, like of Paul, for example.
Well, I
But
think
Paul
Ricky
doesn't
and I
do
are
this.
making-
Josephus doesn't do this. Pliny the Younger doesn't do this. Tacitus doesn't do this.
In
Josephus
Tacitus'
does
biography,
this.
yeah. Tacitus' biography
Josephus
is written
refers to himself in
anonymous.
the first person all the time.
No. Not
I was there for this. I saw this happen.
Bro,
I
there-
asked the emperor for this. That's how he wrote.
We're not saying in every single place of Josephus. There are portions in Josephus, you know this, where he does speak of himself in the third person when he's talking about generals and leaders. All of a sudden, he's calling himself Josephus. Why? Just say, I did this like you did in your other writings. That's the point. There's certain points where he does change the style and the way he's writing and representing somebody else, as opposed to his own personal experience and telling his own story. There are changes of this. Xenophon does the same thing.
But the gospel authors don't. They remain anonymous throughout every single gospel. They don't change it at all.
Well,
Except
I mean, like,
John.
You're referring to the last chapter of John?
Well, he calls himself an eyewitness in chapter 1, and then he identifies himself as the beloved disciple. I think he's identifying multiple of them. But even in that, I guess I don't understand. Are you saying that there are not earlier biographies where this technique isn't used in biographies that are
No,
in
that's not
writings?
I'm saying that.
So
I
why
don't
is this
know.
unique?
Huh?
So how is this unique? How are the Gospels unique? Xenophon does it. There's I mean, Josephus in places. I know you're saying that he does, but you also know there's places where he doesn't. He also starts calling himself Josephus.
Right. He's recounting stories that he's heard
about somebody else. In
normal.
those portions, he's talking about somebody else. He's not even
But we
writing about
still
himself.
know he's the author. We still know he's the one saying, I recount these stories. The Gospels don't do that. Except for, like, again, maybe Luke. But again, he never identifies himself. And Josephus' writings, we know it's him.
Or John.
My argument is that the Gospel authors remain anonymous for a reason. They want to remain anonymous. If they wanted to identify themselves, they would have. If they thought it would benefit to the spreading of their message, they would have identified themselves, but they didn't.
Well, I think this sort of ties into
Why
my
is that?
point, because we're talking about Luke and John, and we all know that Luke and John, which are generally considered like the latest of the Gospels, sort of include like Luke's preface and the we passages, and then John, maybe at the opening, we beheld his glory, and at the end, it talks about the writings of the beloved disciple. Even though I'm not sure whether that is referring to the writings of the author or the author referring to the writings of an alleged eyewitness whose writings he consulted. But we don't see that in Mark and Matthew at all. Like, I think that if the Gospels were following any kind of real historiographical discourse, we would see Mark, for example, and the tradition is that Mark was based on, the preaching of Peter.
Mm-hmm.
Mark would have explicitly said that somewhere, like, hey, I'm getting this from Peter. And I know there's a lot of crazy stuff in here, but trust me, this is what Peter was saying. You can go talk to Peter. He's over here, or, he just died recently, whatever the case may be. We don't get any of that in Mark or Matthew. And Matthew is particularly, I think, exceptional in this case because he was supposed to be an eyewitness. And yet he nowhere distinguishes himself as such anywhere in the course of the narrative. And I think that's an important observation to make.
Well, I mean,
then you have to ask, why did Luke and John come later and sort of add these things that the earlier Gospels should have already been doing if they were this kind of literature?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing I'd say is like, I think we're assuming like they had to do certain things. And I think what the point Steve and I are trying to make is like the biography or the genre of biography is so broad. You're going to get times where like Plutarch does something that Suetonius does, or Josephus does something that Plutarch doesn't do. There were so many ways. I mean, even if the Gospels are unique Christian documents, going back to what Boltman argued, they're still so different from each other in terms of style. Like you had mentioned, like Luke has that preface, and John identifies him as the beloved disciple, but then Matthew and Mark don't. So like there's going to be variety in this very broad genre.
I agree that there's going to be variety in certain aspects, but this doesn't seem to be like one of those things where it's like, oh, it's just, you can just chalk it up to the variety, because this seems to be like a case where we have all these other sorts of biographies, especially from the imperial period, and we have the Gospels, and we have all these other biographies doing what the Gospels are not doing, and the Gospels are exceptional in this regard, precisely where we would expect them to be like these other biographies if they were engaging in that sort of discourse. So it's not like, oh, hey, you know, maybe sometimes you could mention eyewitnesses, and maybe sometimes you could say you were there if you actually were there. But it's like everybody who was there and everybody who, you know, had some sort of access to eyewitness testimony, they said it, and the Gospels just don't. And there's very few exceptions to that. You know what I mean? And most of the exceptions aren't from the period. I think I sent you an article, Michael, where Matthew Ferguson talked about imperial period biographies. So we're talking about Cornelius Nepos and Plutarch and Suetonius and Tacitus, where they all say, you know, when they had access to eyewitness testimony or were themselves participants in the narratives, they said as much. They said that they referred to their own memories, their own observations in the first person singular, and the Gospels just don't do that. And what I'm asking you is why don't they? Like, why, if they were really, if that was the sort of literary project that they were carrying out and they were following these Greco-Roman biographical models, why don't they actually follow them if that's what you're going to posit? And if they're not following them, how can you say that they're really trying to relay stuff that actually happened in the way that these other authors are?
Okay, so if I understand, go ahead, Stephen. Did you want to say something?
No. Go ahead, Mike. Go ahead.
So if I understand your argument correctly, it's that they're not doing something that other biographers do, where they sort of identify themselves in certain places. I mean, the first thing I would say is like Mark is writing about the life of Jesus that he did not participate in. There'd be really odd for him to come up and just say, you know, this is where I came in. I mean, that's not really part of it. Luke, of course, is not there either. And then we see John does do this. So, I mean, really, you know, Matthew's the odd one out. And if I'm going to say this, I'm like, yeah, you could say they don't share literally everything with the sophisticated biographies of the time. That's not a problem. Like Richard Burge lists all these other reasons as to why they are in the genre of biographies. Craig Keener had some more in his book, Christ to Biography, that we covered in the series. It just seems like there's all this data there. And if we say, yeah, but there's this one point where they don't line up, sure. I mean, like I think Loveday Alexander lists, you know, prologues from the ancient world. And like one of the ones that they always said in the prologue is they tried to avoid style or being too stylistic. And Luke doesn't mention that. So yeah, he doesn't get literally everything, because I don't think there was like a cheat sheet they could follow along. I just think there was a general way they understood how to write these things, and they didn't always do everything exactly the same because they lacked the cheat sheet.
And I agree with that, but that comes back to the point about spectrum. So it's not like you have like, okay, biography, and then with biography, you have this very specific set of expectations. You have like different kinds of biographies, right? And so the question is, what kind of biography or subgenre of biography are the Gospels, and what sort of conventions were they following, and what can we get out of them as a result of understanding what those conventions were? And if they're not really following the conventions of the more historiographical biographies, to the point where we can say like, hey, they're really engaging in some kind of serious historical project, then, you know, like, what do you do with that? Like, how can you say that that's what they were actually doing, rather than, for example, just making up edifying tales and so forth? And I think there's a lot of good examples for that. Like, I know we kind of skipped past it because we got into this topic, but I think there's a lot of Gospels that really illustrate like why we're not really dealing with a real historical, you know, narrative in a lot of these cases. And, you know, I don't want to, like I said, speak too much, but, you know, but if you want me to give a couple of examples, I can definitely do that.
Well, I think the problem comes into this because we do see Gospels that try really, really hard to include the writer and make sure that they sell you on who they are, like the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Peter. I mean, the last line of the manuscript we have, I, Simon Peter, and my brother Andrew went fishing, blank. Manuscript cuts off right there. Right. They are trying to sell you. What they're not, what's ironic is we don't see anybody trying to sell us on Luke and Mark. And so the question has to be asked is what insanity is it to put Luke and Mark on gospel accounts, who are, one of which is admitting he wasn't an eyewitness? What do you benefit by forging accounts, putting those two names on it? Sure. Yeah. Matthew was one of the 12. Okay. That makes sense. John, one of the 12. That makes sense. We see the second century gospels working really, really hard to sell you that they are Mary, that they are Thomas, that they are Judas, that they are Peter. But then you get to the gospels and you don't see them trying to sell you on anything. It's just kind of generic and unconventional, as you mentioned.
Except John.
Well, there's the reason for that.
By description, right? Yeah, by description, the beloved disciple. Which seems to be identified with one of the very first people that shows up on the scene in John chapter 1, with Andrew specifically. But as it relates to Mark and Luke, what would the church gain by putting those two names? Mark, if he's the same Mark that we see expressed later, he's kind of a coward. He leaves everybody high and dry, and he sets Paul and Barnabas against each other. And then if you have Luke, all you really know about him is that he's kind of hanging around with Paul in his epistles, and he's a beloved disciple of Paul that is a doctor. That's it. Like that's all you have. Like you wouldn't write a gospel of Eutychus. I mean, another person, or Onesiphorus, who's mentioned, like the gospel of Onesiphorus. Onesiphorus,
Luke and Acts never claims he's a doctor. That's only in Colossians, one of the pseudo-Pauline letters.
There's lots of historical writers in the church that call him a doctor. A lot. A physician.
Yeah, like post-second century, third, maybe.
Well, church fathers.
The gospel itself never says, it's not until Colossians where Luke is called a physician.
Really?
Right.
Okay, so
it's kind of a moot point.
No, well, but again, if you look at Luke's gospel, there's a lot of reasons to believe a physician is behind this. And I've demonstrated this. I don't even remember if it was in the Luke series you did, where you posted some of the research there, Michael, or if that was a separate video.
So Luke Vandewey's got a paper coming out, and him and I talked about it. It should be out pretty soon, but he gave me a forthcoming. He gave me an early edition that has entered a couple revisions. But yeah, the medical language paper. Yeah, I cited it in the video. Yeah,
right. Well, and I've submitted on that, and it's. I'm glad it's gaining traction. It's about time, because somebody overdid it in the 19th century, and so. Now the rest of us are trying to be like, okay, like that's reaching for $1 million here. Like, let's back it up and actually take the validity. For example, the very first line that is in Luke's gospel that you guys were just talking about, like, oh wait, the preface seems to be a certain way. I mean, we have people saying that he's a doctor by profession. The Anti-Marcionite prologue says that. The Muratorian fragment calls him a well-known physician. I mean, we have all these statements from, like you mentioned earlier, Ricky, you talked about Irenaeus. Jerome even goes so far as to say Luke was a physician from Antioch, and his writings indicate it. Now, here's Jerome, who created the Latin Vulgate, probably one of the most educated people in Rome in the 4th century into the 5th, putting together an entire translation of the Bible, and he gets to Luke and Acts. And in his preface to Luke, and he's writing this out, the one thing that he says in his first line about Luke is, this is Luke, the physician of Antioch, as his writings indicate. He, moving Greek Luke to Latin Luke, is struggling to transfer some of the language over because of the physician-like terms. Now, I'm not as good at Greek as Jerome, but then you go to the very first line where he says that many have undertaken. Epikuriason is the word that he uses there. And then that whole entire phrase, that first line of Luke's gospel, is right there in Hippocrates' opening to his healing manual. Like verbatim, and he changes the last line. Over and over and over again, we see this continual technique that he uses with forms that we see in Galen or Hippocrates and other ancient physicians and their writing and healing manuals. So Jerome's saying it. Is Jerome wrong when he's translating all this over to Latin? That no, I'm finding a lot of physician-like instances here, or is he running into this problem as he's moving Greek to Latin? He's clearly
what
running
year
into
did Jerome translate the Latin Vulgate?
5th century, early 5th century.
So
Started probably in the late
right,
4th.
pretty late.
He's
already beholden to the tradition that Luke was a physician.
But he's saying the language shows
it. That's not
it.
in Acts.
But he's saying the language shows it.
The language shows that maybe there was a physician involved, but that a physician never identifies himself as Luke or an eyewitness of Jesus.
So who else would it be?
There's like an anonymous person.
But why attach Luke to him?
Why wouldn't they identify themselves as Luke?
No, I'm just saying, why put Luke's name on it? If you're trying to sell
the author of Colossians the first one to identify Luke as a physician?
Hold on. I'm going
Why
back
does
to
the author of Luke and Acts not do that? Why does the author of Luke and Acts not do what the author of Colossians
because I think it's quite clear that he's not trying to write something about himself. He's trying to write the history of the early church and a biography of Jesus. He's not going to go, by the way, guys, if you guys need a doctor, just hit me up.
But that's what they did. That's what they did in the ancient world. If you had like weight to your name, you made sure you put that in there. That's what Paul does. That's what Josephus does. That's what who else? Tertullian does. So
like in terms of writing the biography, though, like you mentioned Tacitus earlier, like Tacitus wrote a biography of his father-in-law. He doesn't jump in and say, I, Tacitus, I'm honored to write this because I am worthy to do this kind of thing. Same with like when Josephus writes his autobiography. Same with like the other biographies of the ancient world. So I'm like confused as to why they necessarily
Jesus isn't writing an autobiography.
No, I'm using them as examples.
Paul kind of does, right? And he introduces his letters that way.
In a letter, yeah. It's not like
I don't think he's writing a biography to anybody.
No, not then. He recounts certain narratives that happened during his life, but no, I'd agree. It's not.
The churches have kept account of these texts. These texts were written to Christian communities. I don't think anybody argues with that, right? I mean, These texts were written to Christian communities. These Christian communities held these four gospels near and dear. Not 5, not 7. They held these 4 near and dear. This is a part of their tradition. This is a part of their training. These bishops that were left there, like the names that you're referring to, these were left in the churches of the apostles that are under their succession. They know the origin and conception of it just as much as we do about things in our lifetime or close to our lifetime. They were entrusted with these texts. This is what it means to guard the deposit of faith that was given to them. And these manuscripts would not have been distributed without names. Nobody would have received this. We see this in Tertullian. Tertullian talked about manuscripts that, in fact, this is exactly what Marcion tried to do, is to produce a gospel anonymous. And Tertullian called him out and even said, who in the churches would have ever received an anonymous gospel? Who would have ever done it? Did Marcion think
Marcion didn't try to produce a gospel?
He did. He mutilated the gospel of Luke. He mutilated the gospel of Luke, but he submitted it anonymously.
Right, because it was originally anonymous. He just took certain parts out.
And Tertullian said that no church would have ever taken that serious, having received a gospel without a name. They would have never done it, which tells us that the gospels would have been transmitted at that point with names on it. And
so Marcion's gospel had a name on it?
It was
I'm genuinely asking. I don't know.
It's the opposite. Anonymous gospels were not received by churches. They were seen as suspicious. They had no provenance. They had no character. They know what going back. Just like Theophilus is receiving a letter. In Luke's gospel, if he's getting a letter, Theophilus isn't just going to accept anonymous from just random person. That message that was given to him in the Gospel of Luke would have had a name on it somewhere. It may have been on the front of the manuscript, the leaf of the manuscript. It may have been in the heading. And these,
but nowhere in the body.
No. Why would he?
I mean, I just go back to Simon
Why wouldn't
Gallicle's
he?
paper. Simon Gallicle's paper, the alleged anonymity of the Gospels. I mean, like they didn't identify themselves in the body. I mean, he found 2 from the ancient world, and one was a fictional biography where they are identifying themselves in the actual body. Simon Gallicle's point is that they did this, but in like a title and a tag and a flyleaf, something on the back of the scroll, perhaps. They just didn't identify themselves in the body when you were specifically trying to write a life, aka a biography.
I think that Ricky and I may depart from each other on this question. I mean, like, to be honest with you, I'm kind of in your camp on this, Michael and Stephen. Like, I really don't. For me, as far as the authorship goes and the traditions about authorship, to me, they could go either way, and I'm okay with it going either way. It's fine. And I don't think an author necessarily has to identify himself in the body of the text in order, for the legitimacy of the attribution to be,
I agree with that.
But at the same time, like, I guess my question would be, like, I think we kind of got away from the point that I was trying to make.
Yeah, real quick, Eric, just want to say, like, let's get your point out, and then I want to go back to Ricky because I don't think he's had a lot of time to talk. So let's get your point out. We'll discuss it for a little bit, go back to Ricky, and then we'll do some super chats.
You're good. I'm totally content just listening and absorbing. But
okay, I just want to make sure that if you got something you want to say, I don't want to.
I don't feel like my toes are being stepped on or anything.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are you sure? Because I don't.
Unless you just want me to talk, and then I'm happy to oblige.
I mean, you do have a deep, sexy voice. I'm not going to complain.
I get that a lot. Not that much, but sometimes.
Go ahead, Eric.
Like I said, I mean, I'm perfectly fine with even the names being attached to the documents from the very beginning, or the early church, really having some sort of traditions that they really thought went back to these names, and they wrote those down in the paratext faithfully or whatever. Like, I'm totally okay with that. I guess my question would be, one of my main questions anyway, would be to you and Stephen, would be, like, in light of the fact of, like, what we understand about how ancient historiography was written, like some of the, like, the main conventions, not just like little variations that you could expect, like, in different sorts of texts, but like some of the main conventions of how ancient historiography was written, and that are, like, generally, you can like almost fully generalizable. If the Gospels aren't meeting those sorts of standards and those sorts of conventions, how can you say that the authors of the Gospels were really trying to pass off their stories as what really happened? And I'm okay with, like, all the names, the verisimilitude. I think that you could easily construct a hypothesis where the Gospels are sort of inventing things, but also have a motivation to make that narrative plausible to their audiences, especially if they were from the area, from the region, knew people who had these names and so forth. That doesn't really make a difference to me. I don't think it really increases the probability of this mention the stories either way. But like, if they're not following these standard historiographical conventions, how can you say that they really wanted their readers to understand, like, hey, this stuff can be really historically defended?
Okay.
Sorry,
you want to go first, Stephen?
No.
I'll be quick.
Go ahead.
I'll be quick, and then you can jump in. So yeah, I totally get where you're coming from. Like, they don't do everything like the sophisticated biographies do. And so I think that's a total neutral point. It just sort of goes, okay, well, how do we know this is reliable? How do we go? And then we say, well, we go to, like, Luke Vandewey. He uses these aspects to show, like, his book, The Historical Tale, lists reasons to think that they are trying to report truth, and how they list this, and this. Or you go to some work by some of the other scholars, like, what's his name? Craig Blomberg's book, The Historical Reliability of John's Gospel. He lists so many internal and external clues to show that this would be aligned with eyewitness testimony and someone who was getting things right. I totally get where you're coming from. There's not a place in the Gospels where he goes and he says something like, you can trust me on this story because I spoke with Cleopas and he said this kind of thing. Like, I think they're doing that because I don't think they want to pull the readers or I guess the audience, because these would be read out loud, out of the story to give them these kind of details. Again, they're trying to teach like the common man or the popular man, as we mentioned earlier. So I think what you're bringing up is a neutral point, and it's an important point for sure, because then it forces us to again do what we did in the 15-part series, give other reasons for thinking that these are reliable accounts.
Yeah. Okay. So a lot of like some of the points you just made were just related to like verisimilitude. So, but I think that's fine. I mean, I think you can have verisimilitude and invention in the same document like that. I don't think that really makes that big of a difference as far as like.
Let me jump in. I think the issue of whether the Gospels retain reliable information and whether they were written by eyewitnesses are two completely different subjects. Two completely different arguments. Just because something is written anonymously doesn't necessarily mean it's less reliable than something that's written by eyewitnesses. Now, if you want to say the Gospels have reliable information on it, cool. We can have that conversation. If you say they're written by eyewitnesses, there's some problems there. But it doesn't necessarily mean the Gospels are all like completely fabricated. You have Josephus who says, I know eyewitnesses who changed their story for their own personal benefit. Was it Diodorus who said, if you're recording the account of someone who's long-winded, who gives a long speech, it's okay to summarize that speech. Cicero says you should leave out unflattering details when recording stories about my life. So that's okay. So when we look at the Gospels, it's saying they're not written by eyewitnesses doesn't necessarily mean they're unreliable. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think what I was trying to say, maybe I didn't get it right, is that I think we point to other reasons. Like this is Luke Vandewey's point. We point to other reasons, like historical tells, that point to it being eyewitness testimony, and that does help reliability. Going back to what we were originally discussing, you're right. It doesn't prove, or it's not the same thing necessarily. But go ahead, Stephen.
And with Josephus' point is that there are people that do that in these different stories to embellish or whatever. And so the nice thing is we don't have one gospel account. We have 4. And when you look at them, there's a lot of consistency in stories. And I think, Michael, you were talking about this recently.
Also a lot of inconsistencies, though, to be fair.
Well, start with the consistent ones, though, right? Because it's easy just to jump to the inconsistent and say, well, there's no reliability in here at all. We don't know what the heck Jesus said. We don't even know if he, whatever. Because there's the part where everybody wants to jump to the inconsistency side of it, but ignore the vast consistency between specifically the synoptics. Michael, was it a video or where was it that you said you were talking about this recently, where there's a consistency across the Gospels?
Somebody did Paul Anderson's book, The Fourth Gospel. He on page 129, he lists all the aspects of Jesus's ministry the Gospels all talk about. The ministry of John the Baptist, the voice crying on the wilderness, Jesus's baptism of Jesus, his entrance in the Galilee, feeding on the 5,000, the sea crossing, Peter's confession. And then he goes through other things as well, like the deliverance or delivered to Pilate, Roman trial, death of Jesus, witness on the cross, burial, women at the tomb. And so his basic point is like, I mean, if we're going to use inconsistencies, we should also consider the consistencies. I mean, if the inconsistencies point to unreliability, wouldn't the consistencies point to reliability in the aspects, in those specific aspects, though?
But vice versa could also be true.
Well, my point is,
it's a double-edged sword.
It's a double-edged sword. But my point was, is if Josephus is talking about the way that eyewitnesses were doing things in his day, those things weren't held in check with similar accounts, because we have no idea what accounts he's even referring to, other than maybe somebody telling stories of war, which is probably the case. But here we have actually 4 accounts that can either be corroborated, or they can be, like you in your position on things, change or different or edited. But there's a lot of consistency at the same time, holding things in check to prevent that embellishment or that longevity or so forth, because they're either going to correct the other gospel account or agree with it. And there is a lot of agreement. There's more agreement than disagreement, especially in the synoptics. Would anybody differ with that? There's more agreement than disagreement?
I mean, I'm okay with that. I mean,
where are you at, Ricky?
there's agreement with the details. I think there's more disagreement with the overall goal or of each gospel, but we don't have to go into that right now.
As far as the
Let's,
narrative, the teaching, the miracles.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Yeah, let's
We'll
get
just
to
go with
some
that for the sake of simplicity for right now.
Let's get to some super chats here because we're almost up to 2 hours, and I promised that we would try to wrap up around that time. So we'll do some of that here, and do Dadpool and Eric use oral transmission as an alternate explanation to eyewitness testimony, or do they doubt the trustworthiness of the eyewitnesses?
You want to go first, Ricky?
Oh man. Do we use oral transmission, the alternate explanation of eyewitnesses' testimony, or do they doubt the trustworthiness of the eyewitnesses? I don't believe the Gospels are eyewitness testimony. I do believe they're the result of oral tradition. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean I think it's entirely false. Again, like I said, that just means I think saying that these stories are from eyewitness testimonies doesn't bear as much weight as apologists typically think they do. From an ancient author's perspective, that wasn't super important to be an eyewitness to these events they're recording, as much as it is today. We value that much more today than they did 2,000 years ago. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I would disagree, and I think we talked about it in the series on the Gospels. But I mean, that's. Did you want anything, Eric, to that before we move on?
Yeah, personally, I don't think that. I'm not sure about this whole idea of oral transmission behind the Gospels. I'm really skeptical about that. I think that's a hypothesis that came out of a specific historical setting, and that it's just kind of been assumed in scholarship for a long time. But I think I get the question. Like, do we think that it's anonymous oral traditions versus eyewitness testimony, or are we arguing against the trustworthiness of the eyewitness testimony in the sense that we think it's eyewitness testimony, but we think they were wrong in some way? And my answer to that is that while I don't think there's really like some sort of strong oral tradition behind the Gospels, whatever's true in the Gospels would obviously have to go back to eyewitness testimony. So if we think there's anything true, whether Jesus was crucified by Pontius Pilate or whether he rose from the dead, if any of that is true, it has to go back to eyewitnesses. Mm-hmm. So unless we think the entirety of the contents are mythical, there's some eyewitness testimony in there. But I just don't think that reliance on eyewitness testimony is the dominant mode of composition in the Gospels. And even if there is some eyewitness testimony in there, I don't think that really limited the authors of the Gospels in terms of what they wanted to say, what they wanted to write, or how they wanted to, construct their pictures of Jesus. That's how I would answer that question.
He also had Hume's abject failure destroys assuming naturalism. I think he's just referring to the methodology there.
Someone would have to educate me on that.
There's a book called Hume's Abject Failure written by the atheist John Ehrman, and it's reply.
I don't know how to read, so.
Oh, okay. Well,
fill me in.
Without the Gospels, we still would have enough ancient manuscripts to outline who Jesus was and what he did. Gospels just go into depth of what he taught. Yeah, but I would say I don't think we would have enough to actually make like a resurrection argument or argue to have that discussion. It would just be a lot more up in the air, I'd say.
It's generic.
The strict manuscript evidence is very problematic. Just as simply as I can put it. Yeah, there's some consistency throughout them, but it's not as much consistency as people would probably like there to be.
What do you mean by that? Well, are you talking about of the New Testament, or are you talking about just of different patristics?
Anything, the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament. What's our earliest manuscript? P30 or P52?
P52, P66,
P65 is like 3rd century. And then in between that is very fragmentary. And that's not weird. That's normal.
Yeah,
that's very in that time just disappeared because they were destroyed by nature. Mm-hmm. Doesn't mean they were intentionally destroyed, but they just disappeared because they don't stand up to the test of time.
Well,
but what we do have
Yeah,
We can see
papyri
their-
lasts 100 to 120 years.
What's that?
Papyri last 100 to 120 years if well preserved. The fact that they survived the sands of Egypt is the only reason they survived at all. If they had been in any kind of humidity, they would have never survived.
Right, because they're
what we
usually
do have.
sealed in like clay pots. Right.
Right. And so
Or
papyri
tightly
just
rolled in scrolls. Which is
not the
why
New Testament. They were not in scroll form. Some of them may have been. Like
P45 was.
we can assume.
No, P45 was a book form. I'm sorry.
Yeah, most of the New Testament, we only have about a handful of scroll forms of the New Testament. The rest are in papyri codexes, which is also kind of nuanced as well. The scroll form, like we see in the Dead Sea, makes more sense than what we see with the New Testament. And the fragmented nature of them is because bugs, weather, using human hands. I mean, it's a leaf material. I mean, it's a compact leaf material from Egypt. So yeah, we would expect to see that, but we also have patristic citations of the New Testament too that are earlier than the manuscripts that we have, whether you're looking at the Didache or First Clement or the Epistle of Barnabas or anything like that. I mean, most of my doctoral research was extrapolating those things from the codexes that we do have of these writers, these early patristics, and seeing the textual analysis compared to the critical editions of the New Testament we have today, whether or not they're quoting a similar form of the New Testament or even the Septuagint, because they did a lot of the Old Testament. Are they citing very similar texts that we have today? And there's some consistency for the majority. There are some nuances and textual variants where they're very unique, or they only match with one single manuscript tradition. So there's some pretty cool data out there, is what I'm saying. But I don't think anybody would argue that we have. I mean, I even think Ehrman would say that we have a major consistency even in the manuscript tradition when it comes to reliability. We could argue about the 7% and how significant or insignificant that 7% is. But as a whole, there's really no variation in the resurrection narrative in the manuscripts.
I'll let you.
I'm just going to let that slide for the sake of moving forward.
Fair enough. We're approaching 2 hours, so if any of you three need to leave, feel free. I can go through super chats. We can just mention our final thoughts here in a minute, just so we can all get out anything we want to get out. But I'm not gonna try to make a debate at this point. If you guys want to just if you want to really trash the Gospels, this is your chance. So Joseph said, if I made up a story about my city, it still wouldn't match real life distribution, since humans struggle with probabilities. 1 in 10 people tend to pick 7. 86% suggest the stories are based on real events. And yeah, that's, I guess, the point we were trying to get earlier, is that people tend to just think popular names if you're making up a story. They don't tend to give a good naming distribution throughout long accounts, like from the Gospels all the way up to Acts. But you guys can comment on that if you want.
Isn't there like 9 different Johns in the New Testament?
Yeah, and that's actually one of the things Luke Vandeweghe uses, is that they're all sort of like you have John the Baptist, you have these other Johns, and they and they have to be distinguished out by those names, so that because that was such a popular name. Like if John the son of Zebedee, he needs to be distinguished from like John the Baptist, and that's because that was such a popular name. Like this is why when people are talking in the Gospels, they say Jesus of Nazareth, because that was also a popular name.
Well, I think one of the interesting points that I've had questions about, because really, I'm really open to that kind of research. I like it. I really love that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. I think that, well, I'm not sure on the statistical significance of these sort of name distributions and how they line up with the Gospels. But one of the arguments that I do find interesting is the disambiguation kind of thing, where the Gospel authors disambiguate precisely those names that are more common than some of the rarer names. So I think that's really interesting. That fascinates me, and I don't know, I really don't know what to do with that. I think that's really interesting. So but again, I think that
I'll send you a copy of this book if you want.
Right on. Yeah. But again, I think that even if the authors literally new people with those names, that really wouldn't really alter my view of like the nature of the stories that they're trying to construct, you know. But anyway, that's just my opinion. So
just got here. Who's winning? Oh, the Muslims are destroying us. They destroyed us.
Oh my god. That argument for scientific credibility or accuracy, like, oh, we can't.
Did you see the video I just posted Saturday? I basically said, listen, if you want to show those scientific miracles in the Quran, why don't you go to the Quran and start using it to do science? Like, prove that semen comes from the backbone and the ribs. Like, use the verses to do science and you'll win. Like, no, they can't do that.
No, I didn't see that. I didn't even know you made YouTube videos. I'll have to check those out.
You're on one, buddy.
Am I? Oh, Jesus.
Yeah.
Personally, I wanted to learn more from Stephen about the patristic literature. Like, that's not something that I really get into, and I know Stephen gets into that. So, you know, hopefully we can have a conversation in the future about more of that stuff.
I've been accused of spending more time in the patristics than the Bible. That's one of the criticisms the Christians give me. It's like, do you even read the Bible? It's like, is that a joke? It's like every time you're quoting something, you're in First Clement or Second Clement, or you're quoting something for one of Ignatius's letters. Like, okay, I mean,
it's like, welcome to early church history.
It's a part of our
take
heritage.
Off your shoes, stay a while.
I happen to think our Christian heritage goes beyond the first century. My bad. These are the early church fathers. Of course, I read them.
Is Marcion's Gospel a Greco-Roman biography? Well, we don't really. I mean, Stephen, what you would be the one to ask us. I mean, we don't have a copy of it, so we don't really know what he redacted and changed.
We have like proposed reconstruction.
We think we've reconstructed it.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I wasn't aware of that. Interesting. He also says, is the Gospel of Hebrews a Greco-Roman biography? I don't think. Wait.
No, we only have fragments. We have fragments of the Gospel of the Hebrews. The Gospel of the Hebrews is an interesting. And some of the church fathers kind of funny about that, little side note, because it seems like they're conflating the Gospel of the Hebrews with a Hebrew Matthew. And it's funny how that happens, because I think they're actually distinct documents, but some people have conflated them. They're not the same. They're actually distinct. And if you read Origen specifically on that, or Epiphanius on that, Epiphanius is far more clear about the distinction of these two things. But there was a Gospel of the Hebrews. I make an argument particularly that the story of the woman caught in adultery, John 7:53 through 8:11, arose from a tradition out of the Gospel of the Hebrews. And we have reason to believe that. Papias is one of the people that points us to this. There's also another document called Didaskalia, the teaching, that has the similar story. So we can actually trace some of the early, and so it could be that books like the Gospel of the Hebrews contain also oral traditions, kind of like what Eric was talking about earlier. We would say that gospels like that do contain some sort of oral traditions that may have been passed on to the churches in these texts that were not received fully by the churches, as the four gospels were. Stories like this woman caught in adultery, for example, I don't believe John wrote at all. I wrote an entire research paper. You can read it in academia.edu. It's there, showing that the language is completely Lucan. If it came anywhere, it's probably from a Lucan text, not from a Johannine text. And I show all the Lucanisms. Kyle Hughes from Dallas Theological Seminary years ago posted a research, I think it was doing a master's or his doctorate, I can't remember, and it was on the Lucanisms that were in Story of the Woman Caught in Adultery. I think he came up with 9. I found 12, responded back to him and added 3 more and showed where he'd missed 3. But the point is that the Gospel of the Hebrews, for example, we don't know its composition. One of the few stories that we assume would be in it is a condensed version of the story of the woman caught in adultery, is actually from that gospel as relayed to us by the early church fathers. So no, I don't think it was a Roman biography. I think it was more of focusing primarily on, well, it could have been, again, I don't want to say it doesn't because we don't have it, but it could have been, but I don't think that was its point. It was kind of a copycat gospel.
What would be the motive for the gospel authors to exaggerate or sensationalize? And I'll just say, I think that could very well be the case. I don't think they would have lacked those, but I think this is more of a question for Eric and Ricky.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Eric.
Oh, yeah. Well, personally, I think that there's lots of reasons for example, to boost Jesus's credentials. Like, he really didn't accomplish a lot of political, anything really. He just sort of died, I guess. And so to sort of exaggerate his deeds, like, to draw attention to his teachings or something like that, I think that would be a reason to exaggerate or sensationalize. I think also entertainment. I can't exclude entertainment as a factor for why they want to do that, because if you just sort of write just like a narrative with just like the bare facts, I guess, or whatever, like people are gonna get bored by that. They need something to draw them in.
Right.
Lucian talks about that too.
Yep.
I think you can use like some of the fabulous content to just sort of make it interesting for the audience and draw it to Jesus's teachings and so forth. And I think it actually worked, to be honest with you. But I don't think there's any lack of motivations for why the gospel authors would exaggerate or sensationalize. Sorry, this Jack Daniels is getting to me. So,
well, let me ask you this, Eric. Would you say that the churches and the followers of Jesus? I'm assuming you would say the earliest gospel 70-ish, probably Mark.
Yeah.
Right. Would you say that the church was already growing and had a following before the first gospel in your mind was published 40 years prior to Mark? Was there already a Christian community growing outside of Jerusalem and spreading toward the Roman Empire before 70 AD?
I mean, yeah, I would think so.
So how were they doing that without the written accounts? It would have been oral tradition, right?
I mean, I guess it depends on, what you think, oral traditions constituted. Like, I'm not of the opinion that there were just sort of these biographical traditions about Jesus just being told, like we have the Gospels before the Gospels were written. I don't think there were like these sort of biographical oral narratives about Jesus that were being passed around. I think ancient Christianity involved a lot more than that, than just sort of these stories that we find in the Gospels. So,
right. So they were people attaching to Christianity before the production of these texts, right? And so
from what we can tell, the earliest Christians were converted Jews, like based on creeds from like especially Philippians chapter 2, 1 Corinthians 5. Like it seems like the earliest converts were Jews.
Yeah, sure. Even the New Testament teaches that. Particularly, right. I mean, obviously. So, but my point is they were changing their pagan practices to follow a dead Messiah, who is claimed to be resurrected from the dead, without written text saying so. This is simply off of the testimony of people who were with this dead Messiah, who said they saw the resurrected Messiah, and now there's a massive growth to the point where it became a problem for Jewish leaders because it was jeopardizing their worship in the temple under Roman observation. So the Christian communities were growing for almost 40 years before the first text, which I would think they're earlier, but let's just say they're 70. The first one is Mark, and it's produced in 70 AD. The church community was already beyond that, Ricky. It's already beyond the Jews. It's now into the Greco world. It's already in the Roman world.
I'd agree.
They're latching on to something. So if the texts were just doing the exaggerating and sensationalizing, it must have been something pretty radical before the written text to teach people in the Greco-Roman world and in the Jewish world to leave the safety of their Judaism, which gave them peace with their rabbis and peace with their religious leaders in the temple and gave them the opportunity to worship there. And then to jeopardize, on the other hand, your pagan rituals that you've practiced your whole life, to give all of those things up and become a part of asceticism and a bunch of other Christian practices. Something must have been taught about Jesus from somewhere to cause people who are 150 to 200 miles away from the location to drop all these lifestyles and follow him before the written text. Were those exaggerated, sensationalized, or was there something to it?
I mean, I wouldn't see a problem with that, but personally, like, I really don't know. I don't think we have a lot of data about that sort of early period between, like, for example, Jesus's death and the writing of the Gospels, besides the letters of Paul. And I don't think that, like, when you say like something, I'm not sure that people were like necessarily dropping their practices. I think that you could have a pagan who converted to Christianity and continue to maybe practice pagan religion. Like, we don't have any evidence otherwise. We can't say that they didn't do that. Like they just didn't incorporate Christian practices in, to their daily religious routines, or, just because you were a part of like a sort of like a Christian association doesn't mean that you couldn't also participate in, pagan religious practices or something.
But Christianity was illegal.
Christianity wasn't illegal.
Sure, it was. It wasn't a sanctioned religion.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, but how early can we determine
Where?
that?
Well, first
Christianity
of all,
was ignored and tolerated, and eventually it became illegal by Emperor what's his name?
Josephus talks about it happening, I think, under Augustus.
Christianity being illegal?
Oh no, I meant Judaism. Sorry, I was on something else.
Okay, Judaism. That's a little bit different.
No. There's two fights here. There's fights with the Jews, and even in Paul's, if you only take 7 letters, even in Paul's so-called authentic writings, he references his participation in this. His involvement in how Christianity was treated, because they were expelled from the temple. They were expelled from Christian worship. The religious side of this, from the Roman side, as it progressed, I mean, there's major issues with Christianity, particularly, yes, you are right, Ricky, later on in Rome. But it became a very interesting, the whole Jesus movement itself was under the watchful eye of Rome, even if you were just to take it from the gospel perspective, because it's causing disruption. I mean, that's why Pilate didn't want to deal with it. I mean, because like you said, they would rather just ignore
under
it.
The watchful eye of Rome, though. Even Pliny the Younger was like, I have these Christians who worship this Jesus guy. What do I do with them? I've never heard of them before.
I'm talking about back up. I know you're talking about globally. I'm talking about within the region, because even Jerusalem is under the watchful eye of Rome. There's a reason they had to bring him to Pilate. There's a reason Pilate had to do a full investigation. There's a reason Pilate had to make a verdict. There's a reason he was the one that had the Jews couldn't have crucified him without Pilate. That's why they shoved him over to Pilate. So my whole point of that is that Christianity was a problem. Somebody's not going to stick one foot in paganism and then stick their other foot in Christianity and be able to exist in both worlds.
I'll let you guys respond, and then we need to move on.
I feel like we could talk about this for a while.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to say about that. I don't know. We probably take up too much time.
Do Matthew and John use eyewitness or memory? I mean, Stephen and I would say yes. Eric and Ricky would say no. I think that's the whole conversation.
I would nuance that a little bit, though.
I'd say they rely on tradition.
Mm-hmm.
I would say Matthew and John are group gospels. I'm fine with it. I've written entire things on this. I don't think they're one voice. I think there are many, many voices.
Mm-hmm.
I think the Johannine community is entirely behind it. And I think Matthew's initiation of a text that started in Hebrew Aramaic was later published by the religious leaders in Jerusalem to the ecumenical side of the churches at that point. And it was a group effort. It wasn't a single person. I think Matthew just initiated it.
I'd say the same about Paul's letters. I think they were group efforts too.
See, I think Matthew and John couldn't be more different in their goals.
Very. Oh, I would agree with that.
Yeah.
I would agree with that too.
Yeah.
MJ.
MJ and Steven run it back with Abkey and Cam. I don't know who that is. I don't know. People.
Well,
thanks for this. Thanks for the super.
Well, I was with. I debated against Abkey and Cam Waters.
Oh, right. I forgot about them. Okay. Yeah.
But that's MJ.
Me. I'm Mike Jones.
So what I did. Oh, I see. Because I was like, you weren't in that debate with me.
No, that was Wes.
Wes Huff was like, what are you talking about? Like, oh, I get what he's saying. So they want us to do a part 2, and you and me do it against Cam Waters, and oh boy, good times.
So, thoughts on Nehemiah Gordon and Hebrew Matthew? I don't know who that is, but I'm pretty sure he pushes some pretty fringe stuff. But I'm not in. I don't know who he is.
I'm for
he sounds vaguely familiar, but I can't.
Yeah, I think he's pushing like a Hebrew Matthew thing, and
yes, I think he's the guy that's okay. Tell me if I'm wrong. I think he's the guy that's pushing the fact that we have the Hebrew Matthew now, and it was always the original one, and he's using it off of the medieval manuscripts that have produced the Hebrew Matthew, even though they were translated off the Greek.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Is that the same
so.
guy?
I'm dusting off old memories. I think you're right, though.
Yeah, I think he is. I think he's wrong badly. I do think there was a Hebrew Aramaic form of a Matthew. I don't think we have it. I think what's left of it is preserved in the Greek Matthew in fragmented forms. I certainly don't think we can reconstruct whatever was. Not a chance.
By the way, scholars like Davila and Collins use internal evidence of Enoch not recognizing himself to show Enochian identification. Later edition, the divine son of man predates Jesus, not the Enochian one. Okay. Appreciate the super chat. If you believe the Gospels were reliable, but the resurrection did not happen, perhaps it wasn't included, would you still believe in miracles? If you believe the Gospels were, but they did not happen, perhaps.
I'm trying to understand this.
Yeah, this is a word
were
weird.
reliable for the resurrection.
So
if we omit the resurrection, would we still believe the other miracle claims in the gospel?
Maybe.
I think that's to us. I think that's to us.
I think so. And yeah, I would agree going on 1 Corinthians 15. I think it all hinges on the resurrection. I don't think we can argue for the feeding of the 5,000 like you can argue for the resurrection.
I think the resurrection validates everything that happened prior. If there is no resurrection, there's no validation.
Yeah. Thank you, JG. Why would Marcion publish an anonymous gospel if that wasn't normal in the 140s and was inherently suspicious? Tertullian was being anachronistic. There's little grammar issues in here, so I'm not sure I get this.
No, I disagree totally. In fact, we see a shift in the 2nd century, especially in the rise of Gnosticism, where that form it completely goes away. This is exactly what I was saying. When you look at the Gospel of Mary, it's explicit that it's Mary. If you look at the Gospel of Thomas, it's explicit. He's getting the divine revelation. And so much so he's pulled aside and given secret sayings that are not even to be uttered. The same thing in the Gospel of Peter. That same timeline, which is where the rise of these Gospels is during the time of Marcion, it's not an abnormal thing at this point for him to do so. In fact, because what he was producing was not a whole new content. These other Gospels are completely new ideas. They clearly are borrowing from the four, but on the other hand, Marcion is simply taking a different form of an already established gospel. It's not creating a whole new thing. He's, as Tertullian said, mutilating the Gospel of Luke, and he's editing and removing. He's not creating a whole new thing. But I
think the question is, if the practice was only to accept texts that could be traced back to some name, associated with the apostles, why would Marcion try to push an anonymous gospel if that wasn't going to fly in that era? In the era,
that was Tertullian's point.
Mm-hmm.
That was
Tertullian's. Why would Marcion
point.
do it? And if Tertullian was doing that, then I guess that's sort of the question. Like, was he being anachronistic? Like maybe this gospel that Marcion had was anonymous because that's the way it had been, and Tertullian in his era, because the gospels were associated with names, was like, oh well, this is what we do now. So
if you're looking at it from the perspective of they're producing a whole different account, I get what you're saying. But Marcion wasn't producing a whole different account. It'd be like if I sent you Thomas Jefferson's Bible, okay, and I sent you his Bible where he edited out things. Somebody mentioned that earlier. Was that you, Ricky? Did you mention it? Did you mention?
Yeah, the Thomas Jefferson Bible.
So if I handed you that Bible, you wouldn't be like, "This is a whole new gospel." You would recognize everything in it, but there's parts missing, right? Major stories or sections. You wouldn't say, oh my goodness, this is the Book of Mormon, right? You would recognize its account. It's not a whole new account. It's an edited account. Marcion wasn't producing a whole new account, a whole new gospel. He was trying to slip in an edited form of Luke to the churches. He made one mistake, and that's what Tertullian's calling about. You made one mistake. You didn't put a name on it. You left it anonymous, which actually, by the fact that it was anonymous, he was still able to trace an anonymous gospel, which should be talked about as well. How is an anonymous published gospel still able to be traced back to Marcion? It leaves its footprint even when it's got anonymous forms.
Yeah, according to, if memory serves, according to Irenaeus, or maybe it was Tertullian, I can't remember which, Marcion's followers claimed that Marcion was trying to restore an uncorrupted version of the Gospel of Luke. So they claim that there was a version of Luke that existed and then was corrupted later, and Marcion was trying to restore it back That's
correct.
its original form.
That's correct.
That's
Well, I'll just say one thing. I don't know. I don't think that we can know whether or not, like, one of the points that David Trowbridge makes, for example, is that, even if this gospel was mutilated or whatever, like, we don't know that Marcion did that. He could have inherited something that somebody else did. But I think one of the important points is that, I don't know, like, in the Marcionite collection.
Oh my God, I gotta pee again. Sorry.
No worries. No worries.
In the Marcionite collection of documents, wasn't it associated with, like, wouldn't the readers of the Marcionite collection of documents have associated the gospel with the Apostle Paul? Like, wouldn't that have been implied? Because, like I said, this is one of the points that David Trowbridge makes. Like, it wouldn't have been anonymous. Like, maybe it lacked the title, like the Tertullian would have wanted, for example. But I don't think Marcion would have been pushing it as, like, hey, it's just this anonymous gospel from somebody somewhere. I think he associated with Paul's gospel. That was kind of the whole point.
Well, so did the early church. The church went so far to say that the Gospel of Luke was Paul's gospel. And they would go so far as to claim that when Paul said in Romans, for example, according to my gospel, and then he says it later to Timothy, that he was actually referring to the Gospel of Luke. Both sides could argue that, the Marcionite side and the Orthodox side.
Right.
The point of Tertullian was a little bit bigger than that, though, because he was kind of talking about, how do you separate lock and key? The churches received the initial writings of the apostles because those churches were starting by the apostles. Therefore, the headquarters of these texts were the initial receivers. These are the ones that have received these manuscripts of the Gospel of Luke. And this is the ones that they had been teaching, memorizing, doing homilies from, and distributing to the other churches. Marcion comes along, and now a new form has slipped in of the same gospel, the Gospel of Luke, which is now being called out everywhere. It's not just Tertullian in North Africa who's recognizing. It's now you've got Irenaeus and Lyons in France who's pointing it out. He's writing an entire treatise against it. Now you have the entirety of that section of the churches from Africa to Europe saying, this is not the Gospel of Luke we've received. This doesn't match what we've had all along. He tried to slip in a new mandate, and the churches didn't buy it because the churches were the lock and the key. The texts were preserved and protected by the bishops who were put there by the apostles themselves, and they continue to teach and distribute these texts. And when something slipped in that looked completely different or very little at times different, it was instantly called out. Red flags are waved. Next thing you know, we've got against heresies. We've got against Marcion writings. We have an entire document called the Anti-Marcionite Prologue fighting back against this because the entire of the church knew this is off. This is not the letter of Luke we've received.
Well, I just have one question.
Sure.
About that. What do you? I mean, but I think that kind of misses the point. Like, do you think it's plausible that Marcion would just sort of overlook that? Like, hey, I'm just going to mutilate the Gospel of Luke and not have a title on it, and he just like sort of forgot about that. Like, why do you think he did that?
I think he was trying to produce an earlier formation that he believed existed, as his followers said. We don't know all of, because again, his writings didn't survive. We only have a little bit outside of that from, like you said, Irenaeus or Tertullian or some others.
Like his critics.
It seems like he was trying to reconstruct something and eliminate certain themes, and almost
he was probably genuine in his beliefs in doing this. Like, he wasn't trying to make something up. I think he really believed.
Yeah, no.
Again, we don't have a whole lot of.
Every sincere heretic in the eyes of the Orthodox churches was sincerely heretical. Like, to Arius dealing in the Council of Nicaea, he fought tooth and nail that his position of Christ was right.
That's a good comparison. Yeah.
So I don't think that Marcion.
It cost Arius everything.
It did. It cost him everything. We have stories of him going to Peter of Alexandria and Alexander of Alexandria, and during that time, pleading to be reinstituted into the church.
Yeah.
And Peter of Alexandria, before his martyrdom, goes to the tomb of St. Mark, and Arius sends a letter and says, please restore me back into the church, because he was banished. And he pretty much doomed him to hell twice as hard, and then went off and got executed. Here's the point. They didn't want to be excommunicated. They didn't want to have entire treaties written against them. They had sincerity in what they were doing. They may have been sincerely wrong, which is our argument on this side of it, that Marcion was sincerely wrong, trying to do a good thing. I don't think he was trying to slip in a secret gospel like the Gnostics. This is why I think the question and saying that Tertullian was being anachronistic, I just don't think that's a fair statement, because you're comparing apples to oranges here. You're talking about Gnostics who are trying to slip in new mandates completely, intentionally to deviate to a new theology. I don't think Marcion was necessarily trying to do that.
Mm-hmm. Sassy IP has this to say. Thoughts on the priestly source creating Genesis? I would say see my series on the documentary hypothesis. I got 10 videos out on it so far, and there's a playlist linked under it.
I don't think nobody argues that the priestly source created Genesis. So
that's just not accurate. The idea is that Genesis is a combination of, I believe, non-P and P or J, and then later parts E is included as well as then P is. So that's not the actual argument. For Dadpool and Eric, what would a reliable gospel look like in your view? What is the threshold for credibility? Is it the entire narrative or the supernatural elements in it that are unreliable?
That's a good question. I think naturally we all have a suspicion, like when we encounter like that sort of content, like miracles, for example, like we have a natural suspicion, like, okay, like, what is this? You know, if I told you that I got up this morning and walked on water, like, you'd be like, okay, no, you didn't. But I think if the gospel authors really believed in the contents of what they were narrating, then we would expect more, signals or signposts in the actual text that they really believed what they were saying. Like, we would expect some sort of preface. We would expect more citation of eyewitness testimony explicitly, not these subtle clues or something like that we find in like Bacchum or something like that. They would be like pretty direct about that. You wouldn't have to like sort of guess at it. I don't know. Like, maybe like if there were, I don't think that even if they did that, I don't think that it would be necessarily, it would look credible. I think we would need like more external evidence for something like that. I don't think you can go from like looking at the Gospels and saying, "Oh, this looks credible," and determine that they're credible at all. So
I'd say compare the Gospels with another like historical text, like the writings of Herodotus. Was writing like early 1st century. I think like very early 1st century, if I'm remembering right. He writes a lot of historically like credible information. He was a historian. He traveled around the world and he wrote what he saw and what he heard. And a lot of it, when compared with other external sources, like Eric was saying, seems to be true. However, he also says like the king of Persia had like ants the size of foxes that could dig for gold for the prince. So, and he said some other wilder stuff. Sorry. That I won't share here on stream.
Hey, there are virgin ears listening. There are Christians who never heard that word before.
Pretty weird out there stuff. So a lot of what he said was can be verified using other sources, but some things he said.
And also to get to the second question, I don't think that it's just the supernatural elements that look suspicious. I think a lot of the mundane stuff looks suspicious too. Like a lot of psychologically implausible characterizations and stuff like that. So
yeah, we wanted to talk about that, but I don't think we have time to really get into the psychological.
I made it this entire stream without cussing, and I was so proud of myself. And I just let
it's because we went over 2 hours, guys. He set his mind on 2 hours, and here we are.
Yeah. How valid is the apostolic succession charts? I mean, they're not. It's hard to really verify a lot of it, but I mean, I don't. I think there's some principle of charity we can apply there, but I know Stephen's got a lot he can say.
No, another day, another time, another time.
Where do you date the Muratorian fragment for Stephen and MJ? And how about the apostolic fathers? Stephen, you can answer this one.
2nd century. If you're talking about copy, no. If you're talking about it gives us a timeline in the Muratorian fragment. It puts us around 170, 180, somewhere in there.
Have you read Clara Rothschild? I think Clara Rothschild has a book, recent book on the potential that it may be like some sort of forgery of some kind that portrays itself as coming from the 2nd century, but that is actually from the 4th century. Have you? I think I don't know. I'd have to look up the name of the book. But have you read that at all? Like Clara Rothschild's work on that?
There's a couple of people with that hypothesis. I don't personally buy it, but reading the book, I have not read the book. But there's a few people that actually make that argument. I think it's later than 4th. I think they argue it's it's later than 4th.
Yeah, it's Clara Rothschild, 2022, the Muratorian Fragment, Text Translation and Commentary. Just a recent work on that. I'm not sure. I don't know. I don't have a dog in this fight. So
yeah, there's some that say it's later. I think it's later than 4th, but it's later.
Wasn't Marcion attempting to distance the Gospels from the apostles or disciples? This would give some insight to why he dropped the name.
We don't know. This is part of the scholarly argument, right?
Yeah.
Motive.
There's no evidence that he dropped the name.
Motive. He certainly didn't drop Paul's name.
Right.
There's an apostle, so he's not distancing himself from that. The thing he's distancing himself from that we can tell from the reconstruction is Judaism, Old Testament citation connection. There was obviously say that again.
The virgin birth,
things like that. Yeah, ideas. So there's definitely a distancing from rabbinical teaching. I would say more than apostolic, because he had no problem associating with the Pauline corpus. So,
yeah.
Well, I don't think Luke is particularly associated with the other apostles anyway. He's associated with Paul, and if Marcion was all about Paul, I don't think that there would be a reason to necessarily drop the name of Luke. You know what I mean?
If you're going to use Paul, you have no problem using Luke, right? I mean, they're in the same. They're in
Right.
the same group. I mean, to me, I wouldn't argue for that. Yeah.
Yeah. This will be the last super chat. So, because we got to close this out. Eric was right. If anonymity was acceptable in the 140s, Marcion would have published a text with a name on it. Or if anonymity wasn't acceptable in the 140s, Marcion would have published a text on it. What are your thoughts? I guess, Stephen, I guess it's challenging you.
I mean, I think we covered that on 3 phases here. That the guys in the audience on these 2 questions are comparing apples to oranges, and I think that Ricky was actually seeing my point here. We're not comparing a whole new text that has been brought into the church, a new narrative with a new author. This is a familiar text that has been edited, mutilated, whatever term you want to use, that is being portrayed as, I have the original form. I have reconstructed what was always supposed to be. I don't think this was an evil, malicious attempt that was necessarily like, and I have Christians who disagree with me, and that's fine. Like, that's okay. I still think Marcion's text is wrong. It is not the original form. I think the original form was preserved in the apostolic churches that were universally rising up against him, just as it did with Arius. So again, regardless of Marcion's motives, his text is wrong. Why he did it, we're still speculating. But as far as comparing it to the anonymity side of things, I don't think that we're arguing the same things here. I think these are apples and oranges.
All right, here. If you're everyone pay attention, bring it in close.
Okay.
We're doing the church thing.
All right, go ahead.
If you're an author in the ancient world and you produce a writing that you want to go viral, we'll use in popular or modern terms, you had 3 options. You could either pretend to be someone who you're not, like so many authors try to do with Paul. Paul used his name as leverage. He was a notable person. He was a person of authority. Everybody knew him. He could use his name and say, I am this guy. And that's why so many other people wrote pseudonymous letters claiming to be him as well. But we can tell by the letters themselves, they don't match the style and rhetoric of Paul at all. So we know they're probably forgeries. You could do that. You could claim to be somebody who you're not. But there were laws against that. Capital punishment type laws. If you were caught forging a document, you could be sentenced to death. We have accounts of this. People did this, and they faced the punishment of doing so. Or you could write the name as yourself. I am Joe Schmo. I weave nets down at the docks down in Galilee. This is the book that I'm writing. No one's going to read what you wrote. If they read that introduction, no one's going to read any further. They're going to stop. Your third option is to produce your letter anonymously. And that would save you from the risk of being prosecuted for committing a crime and just not identifying yourself as a nobody. So you could produce a work anonymously. That would have a better chance of being read without getting in trouble. Then that was your best shot. I think that's why a lot of the authors, including the authors of the Gospels, produced their letters anonymously, because it had a better chance of being read by the general populace.
The only argument I have back is they weren't trying to write these letters to the general populace. They were writing to specific churches.
To a specific audience.
Yeah. I would think that the churches needed to know who is who. This is why when Paul was writing letters and so forth, they mentioned certain carriers, certain individuals who are known to the church.
Relied on certain passages from the Hebrew Bible. Yeah, like there's an audience they were aiming for.
Correct.
But in order to stay safe from the law, it was probably easier to remain anonymous rather than identify yourself.
All right. I'm gonna let all three of you give final thoughts. I'm not gonna give any, so go ahead, Eric, then Steven, then Ricky.
Final thoughts. I think that there's a lot that we didn't get into for sure.
No, for sure.
Your series on the reliability of the Gospels is large, and it has a lot of good stuff in there that I think that is serious and needs to be addressed and accounted for. And I don't think that it always is in a cogent fashion. So it's challenging. I think it's important. I like it. I want more of your content like that. And but at the same time, I guess my position is that I'm just not sure that the kinds of indexes of reliability that you talked about in terms of authorship and some of the verisimilitude, the onomastic congruence and so forth, really would alter my case in terms of why I question these documents. And we didn't really get into any specifics in terms of the specific stories in the Gospels. I wish we had done that. That's okay. Maybe for another time.
Yeah, maybe in the future, you and I could just do a conversation.
Yeah, I like that. So, I really appreciate you, Michael Jones, Stephen Boyce. Always good to hear your insights on things. Like I said, maybe we can talk too.
Sure, anytime.
Yeah, you got that patristic side that I really don't have. If you have any literature that you like to recommend, I'd be glad to read it.
Sure.
Thanks, Ricky, for coming on with me and doing this with me. And I'm glad we were able to talk about this and just be open and honest, talk like men, with integrity, just kind of state our view without, all the BS that can come with a lot of this stuff. I don't have any ulterior motives or ill intentions towards Michael or Steven. I enjoy talking about this stuff. This stuff is enjoyable to me. So I appreciate it. For sure.
That. Yeah.
Hopefully we have a conversation in the future.
Absolutely. Anytime. And I've had conversations in the past with Ricky. I've always enjoyed my conversations with Ricky. We get along pretty well. I think that
speak for yourself.
Hey, I said on my end, I can't speak for everybody here, but I've always enjoyed these conversations and challenging because typically what I do after a discussion like this is where you guys have challenged, I try to go back and say, all right, well, let's look at this more in depth. So I appreciate y'all's pushback and thoughts. As it relates to things that I'd like to get into, I think there's so many tunnels. That's one of the things I was concerned about. I was telling Michael, was like, this could go anywhere. This could go in so many directions because just the comparative of the internal evidence, external evidence, that'll be a fun discussion. Patristic citations, that'll be a fun discussion as well. Certainly, we believe the Gospels are based on eyewitness testimony. I think that is more complicated than some apologists make it to be. I think some apologists do a terrible job of this, like Michael Jones. And I think that there's too generic, the idea that Gospels are eyewitness and all these things, that's so generic. It's too broad. We've got to break that down. It's not as simple as just John sat there and wrote a gospel. I think it's complex. I think there's multiple voices. I think we got to count those voices. Same thing with Matthew. There's complications with Matthew. I think Matthew is the most difficult gospel to defend personally. But I do it. I defend it all the time. But it takes more than just an apologetic 101 answer. And so these things are deep. They require careful intention, and Christians need to do a better job of conceding on good points made by our opposition, because this is a hard thing. I truly believe it's an accumulative case kind of situation that takes a lot of evidence, not a single piece of evidence. Right. I think it's good stuff. Good stuff. I appreciate you both. Thanks for the conversation.
Yeah. Go ahead, Ricky. Close us out, and I'll hit the end button.
Oh man. I honestly was not looking forward to the stream at all. Just simply because I've been out of the game for a while. So I was afraid I'd be really rusty. I don't remember everything that I used to at one point. I was like, and Eric, this is the first time Eric's ever done a stream. So I was like, he's gonna be relying on me, and I'm gonna drop the ball on this. Just feeling the pressure. But it ended up being a really productive stream, and I genuinely enjoyed this conversation.
Awesome.
So appreciate the invite. I appreciate y'all having me.
Sure.
Yeah. That's about all I got.
Oh yeah. Eric's a smart guy. I knew this would be a good conversation. So yeah, for sure. We'll try to do some more of this stuff.
Shit for sure.
Yeah.
There it is again.
All right, guys. I will be live tomorrow for totally not an April Fool's stream. I promise. It's going to be super serious. Totally not. All right. I'm closing this out. See you guys tomorrow.
All right. See you, man.
You made it to the end of this video, which means this message matters to you. If you want to see more content like this reaching people for Christ, you can help make it happen. Your support makes these videos possible. Click the link below and donate today. And if you want to go even deeper, consider joining our Patreon community. You'll get early access to videos, behind-the-scenes content, and a place to connect with others passionate about this mission.